Right now, you're probably aware that the climate is changing. Maybe you've seen news about droughts in California, the American Southwest drying out, water shortages in places that never had them before. Maybe you've heard about the Mega Drought in the western United States, the worst in 1,200 years. That's concerning, right? 1,200 years is a long time. Except here's something that should absolutely reframe how you think about climate and civilization. 5,900 years ago, it stopped raining. Not just in one place, not just for 1 year or even 1 decade. For 300 years, across 3 continents, the rains failed. Rivers that had flowed for thousands of years dried up. Lakes larger than any on Earth today evaporated into salt flats. The world's largest grassland turned into the world's largest desert. And the people, millions of them, had to go somewhere. This wasn't a bad harvest season that people adapted to and moved on from. This was a mega drought so severe, so prolonged, so geographically massive that it forced the greatest migration in ancient history. It emptied an entire continent. It created modern Egypt. It collapsed the first cities. It triggered innovations that we still use today: writing, irrigation, centralized states. And it happened within living memory. People lived their entire lives watching their world slowly die, watching the green places turn brown, watching the water disappear, knowing that what their grandparents had told them about the land of plenty was now just a story, a memory of a world that no longer existed. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, Melbourne at midnight, London at tea time, all at once. This is the story of the 5.9 kilo-year event, the mega drought that reshaped human civilization 5,900 years ago. And the remarkable thing is how little we talk about it, considering it created the ancient world we think we know. So let's go back to a time before this catastrophe, to see what the world actually looked like when it was working, when it was thriving, when nobody could imagine that the rains would ever stop. Because to understand what was lost, you first need to see what was there. It's sometime around 4000 BCE. That's 6,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. You need to forget almost everything you think you know about the ancient world. Forget the pyramids, they don't exist yet. Forget the great temples of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats rising above the plains. Those come later. Forget pharaohs and cuneiform tablets and bronze weapons. None of that exists yet. This is the world before the crisis that would change everything, and it's more sophisticated than you probably imagine. Let's start in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates in what's now Iraq. This is already, by 4000 BCE, the most urbanized region on Earth. The agricultural revolution has been underway here for thousands of years. People figured out how to domesticate wheat and barley, sheep and goats around 5,000 years earlier. They've had time to refine the techniques, to build on generations of accumulated knowledge. And they've done something remarkable. They've built cities. Now, when I say cities, you might be imagining a few hundred people living in mud huts. That's not what this is. Uruk, the largest city in the world at this time, has maybe 10,000 people living within its bounds. Some estimates put it even higher, maybe 20,000. 20,000 people. That's more than lived in most medieval European cities 3,000 years later. And Uruk isn't alone. There's Ur, there's Eridu, there's a dozen other urban centres scattered across southern Mesopotamia, connected by a network of canals and irrigation channels that are themselves engineering marvels. Imagine you're standing in Uruk around 4000 BCE. The city sprawls across the flat alluvial plain, a dense cluster of mud brick buildings baking in the Mesopotamian sun. The streets are narrow, winding between houses that pack together like cells in a honeycomb. Some houses are small, single rooms where extended families live. Others are larger compounds with multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards where you can catch a breeze, where children play and women grind grain, and the daily work of a life happens away from the brutal midday heat. But the most impressive structures aren't the houses, they're the temples. Massive platforms built from millions of mud bricks, rising above the low skyline of the city. The White Temple, dedicated to Anu, the sky god, sits atop a platform 12 meters high. You can see it from kilometers away across the flat landscape. Inside, priests perform rituals that supposedly ensure the fertility of the land, the regularity of the floods, the favour of the gods who control everything that matters: water, grain, life itself. These temples aren't just religious centres, they're economic hubs. The priests manage vast estates, fields worked by hundreds of labourers. They collect surplus grain and store it in massive granaries. They employ scribes who are just beginning to develop a system for keeping track of all these transactions. Not writing yet, not quite, but proto-writing. Clay tokens in different shapes, each representing a quantity of grain or a number of sheep. These tokens get sealed in clay envelopes with marks on the outside indicating what's inside. It's the administrative infrastructure that will eventually become cuneiform, the world's first true writing system. But that's still a few centuries away. The people of Uruk wear linen or wool depending on their wealth. The elite, the temple administrators and the successful merchants wear finely woven fabrics, sometimes with elaborate fringes or decorative borders. The labourers, the farmers who work the fields, and the workers who maintain the irrigation canals wear simpler garments. But everyone eats. That's the crucial thing. The irrigation system works. The fields produce reliable surpluses. There's enough food not just for the farmers who grow it, but for the priests and scribes and craftspeople and all the other specialists who make urban life possible. Walk through the city in the evening when the heat breaks, and you'll hear a dozen languages. Sumerian, probably the language of the south, but also Semitic languages from groups migrating down from the north and west. Uruk is a crossroads, a place where people from across the region come to trade, to exchange goods and ideas. You might see merchants from the Persian Gulf bringing shells and precious stones, traders from the mountains to the east bringing timber and metals, people from the north bringing obsidian and copper. The city hums with this exchange, this constant flow of materials and people and innovations, and this pattern, this urban experiment, is spreading. To the north, along the upper reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates, new cities are appearing. Tel Brak in Syria might have 20,000 people. Hamuka, another Syrian city, is growing rapidly. These northern cities don't rely on irrigation. They don't need to. The rainfall here is sufficient for agriculture. They're dry farming, planting wheat and barley after the winter rains, and harvesting in the spring before the summer heat arrives. It works. It's been working for generations. Nobody has any reason to think it won't keep working forever. Now shift your perspective. Travel west and south, across the desert to the Nile Valley. This is Egypt, except it's not Egypt yet. Not in any sense you'd recognise. There's no unified kingdom, no pharaoh, no great monuments. What you find instead is a patchwork of chiefdoms and villages scattered along the Nile, each controlling a small stretch of the river and the narrow strip of fertile land on either side. These are the Naqada cultures, named after the archaeological site where they were first identified. By 4000 BCE, they're in what archaeologists call the Naqada II period. These communities are prosperous. The Nile floods predictably every year, depositing rich silt across the fields. You plant after the flood recedes, grow your crops through the winter, harvest in the spring. The river provides fish. The marshes provide birds and papyrus. The desert provides game, wild animals that you can hunt to supplement your diet. The villages along the Nile are building impressive structures, not pyramids, those are still 1,000 years away. But temples, ceremonial centres, elaborate tombs for their leaders. The archaeological evidence shows that these communities are developing social hierarchies. Some burials contain elaborate grave goods, beautiful pottery painted with intricate designs, stone pallets for grinding cosmetics, jewellery made from semi-precious stones. Other burials are simple, just a body wrapped in linen or animal hide and placed in a shallow grave. The society is stratifying, some families accumulating more wealth and status than others. But here's the key thing about pre-dynastic Egypt. These communities are independent. The village at Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt doesn't answer to anyone at Naqada. The settlements in the Delta in Lower Egypt have their own leaders, their own traditions. Egypt is fragmented, dozens of separate communities that trade with each other, sometimes fight with each other, but don't think of themselves as one people, one nation. That consciousness, that identity hasn't emerged yet. And it won't, not until crisis forces it into being. The people here live well. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains shows they're healthy, well-nourished. They're eating a diverse diet of bread and beer made from wheat and barley, supplemented with fish, fowl, vegetables, fruits. They're creating art, beautiful objects that show sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. They're trading with distant regions. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan shows up in Egyptian burials from this period. Obsidian from Ethiopia. These are long-distance trade networks requiring complex social relationships maintained across generations. But now, let's travel to the place that will matter most when the drought comes. Let's go to the Sahara. And here's where you need to completely reset your mental image, because the Sahara in 4000 BCE doesn't look anything like the Sahara today. Today it's the world's largest hot desert, a vast expanse of sand and rock where almost nothing lives. In 4000 BCE, it's green. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but across vast stretches of what is now absolute desert. There are grasslands, scattered trees, permanent rivers and lakes. Huge lakes. Lake Mega Chad, in what's now Chad and Nigeria, covers an area larger than the Caspian Sea, larger than any lake on Earth today except the Caspian. It's surrounded by wetlands, reed beds, marshes that support enormous populations of fish, hippos, crocodiles, water birds. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Fish bones in ancient campsites, harpoon points carved from bone, pottery decorated with images of aquatic life. Move west from Mega Chad and you find more evidence of water. Dry valleys that once held rivers, salt flats that were once lakes, archaeological sites, hundreds of them, scattered across regions that have been uninhabitable desert for the last 4,000 years. And at these sites, you find something remarkable: rock art. Thousands of images carved or painted on rock faces showing the world as it was. Cattle, enormous herds of cattle being driven by human figures, giraffes, elephants, antelope, crocodiles, scenes of hunting, of dancing, of daily life. The detail is extraordinary. You can identify species, see the care with which the artists rendered their subjects. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers scratching out a marginal existence. These were pastoral societies, people who herded cattle and goats, who also hunted wild game and gathered wild plants, who lived in a landscape that supported them abundantly. The rock art shows sophisticated cultural practices, religious ceremonies, social hierarchies, some figures larger than others, suggesting leadership roles, communities gathering for festivals or rituals. Archaeological excavations at sites across the Sahara have found pottery, some of the oldest pottery in the world, dating back 10,000 years or more. Stone tools, grinding stones for processing grain, which suggests they might have been cultivating wild cereals, supplementing their pastoral economy with proto-agriculture. Animal bones showing they were keeping cattle, goats and sheep, and most tellingly, evidence of permanent settlements. Not just temporary camps, but villages where people lived year-round, built substantial structures, invested in place because they expected to stay. The environmental evidence backs all this up. Pollen cores from ancient lake beds show the vegetation that was growing, grasses, trees, including species that today only survive hundreds of kilometers to the south in wetter climates. Sediment cores show periods of higher rainfall, rivers flowing year-round. The Sahara was habitable, productive, populated. Maybe not densely, maybe not as densely as the Nile Valley or Mesopotamia, but certainly home to hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people living across this vast region. And they weren't isolated. The Sahara wasn't a barrier in 4000 BCE. It was a bridge. The rock art shows contact between different groups, similar artistic styles appearing across thousands of kilometers. Trade goods, shells from the Mediterranean showing up in central Saharan sites, suggesting exchange networks that connected the coast to the interior. These pastoral societies were part of a larger world, trading, exchanging ideas, probably intermarrying with groups from the Nile Valley, from North Africa, from the regions to the south. Think about what this means for population distribution. Today, the Sahara is basically empty. A few million people live scattered around its edges, clustered near oases, or in the mountain highlands where slightly more rain falls. But in the interior, the vast sand seas and rocky plateaus, almost nobody. In 4000 BCE, the distribution was completely different. The Sahara wasn't a void. It was inhabited space, possibly more populous than the Nile Valley at this point. And critically, it was sustainable. The rains came reliably enough. The grasslands supported grazing animals. The rivers and lakes provided water and fish. People had lived this way for thousands of years. Their ancestors had lived this way. They expected their descendants would live this way. The climate had been stable for so long that it seemed permanent, eternal, the natural order of things. So here's the picture of the world around 4000 BCE. In Mesopotamia, cities emerging, irrigation agriculture producing reliable surpluses, social complexity increasing, the seeds of what will become Sumerian civilization being planted. In Egypt, prosperous villages along the Nile, independent chiefdoms developing their own traditions, creating art and trade networks, but not yet unified, not yet thinking of themselves as one people. And across the Sahara, pastoral societies living in a green landscape, herding cattle, hunting game, raising families, creating art, sustaining a way of life that had worked for thousands of years. 3 different regions, 3 different ways of organizing society, but all of them depending on one crucial thing: water. Reliable, predictable water. The monsoons in Africa bringing summer rains, the Nile flooding annually, the winter rains in northern Mesopotamia falling with enough reliability to support crops. As long as the water came, everything worked. Population could grow, cities could expand, trade networks could reach farther, societies could become more complex, more specialized, more sophisticated. But here's the thing about climate. It's not actually stable, not over the long term. What seems permanent, what seems like the natural eternal state of the world, is often just a temporary configuration, a moment of balance that can shift with changes too subtle for any individual to notice while they're happening, but catastrophic in their cumulative effects. The world of 4000 BCE felt stable, felt secure. The rains had come for so long that people had built their entire way of life around that expectation. They'd invested in place, built permanent structures, developed societies that required the continuation of current conditions to survive. And somewhere around 3900 BCE, in ways that nobody at the time could have understood, something changed. The monsoons that had been bringing summer rains deep into Africa began to weaken. The shift was subtle at first, maybe not even noticeable in any single year. But year by year, decade by decade, the rains became less reliable. The dry season lasted a little longer. The rivers ran a little lower. The grasslands became a little less productive. And slowly, over generations, the green Sahara began to die. Before we watch that world die, before we follow the crisis as it unfolds, we need to understand just how extraordinary the green Sahara actually was. Because this wasn't some brief wet period, some lucky few centuries of higher rainfall. The African humid period, as scientists call it, lasted for thousands of years. It was the normal state of things for so long that it shaped human evolution, human culture, human destiny across an entire continent. And understanding how it happened, why the Sahara was green in the first place, that helps us understand why its loss was so catastrophic, why the drought that ended it changed everything. So let's go back further. Back to around 11,000 years ago, to the end of the last ice age. The great ice sheets that covered Canada and Scandinavia are melting, sea levels are rising, global temperatures are warming, and crucially, the orbital mechanics of Earth are in a specific configuration that has profound effects on climate, particularly in Africa. Now, here's where we need to talk about something called orbital precession, and I promise to make this accessible, because it's actually fascinating once you understand it. Earth's axis, the imaginary line that runs through the North and South poles, doesn't point in exactly the same direction all the time. It wobbles, very slowly, like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. This wobble takes about 26,000 years to complete one full cycle, and as the axis wobbles, it changes which part of Earth's orbit around the Sun corresponds to which season. Right now, in our current configuration, Earth is closest to the Sun during the Northern Hemisphere's winter. But 11,000 years ago, Earth was closest to the Sun during the Northern Hemisphere's summer. That might sound like a subtle difference, and it is. The change in solar radiation reaching Earth isn't enormous, but it's enough to intensify the African monsoon system in ways that transformed an entire continent. Here's how it worked. During summer in the Northern Hemisphere, the land masses heat up more than the oceans. Hot air rises over the land, creating low-pressure systems. Moist air from the oceans flows inland to replace that rising air, and as that moist air is forced upward by the heat, it cools, and the moisture condenses and falls as rain. That's the monsoon. It happens today in India, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa. But 11,000 years ago, with the orbital configuration creating slightly more intense summer heating, the African monsoon was supercharged. It penetrated much farther north than it does today, bringing summer rains deep into what is now the Sahara Desert. And once the rains started, they created a feedback loop that sustained them. Vegetation grew, grassland spread, trees appeared in areas that had been barren, and vegetation does something crucial. It releases moisture back into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, through the water that evaporates from leaves and soil. That moisture feeds back into the monsoon system, creating more rainfall, supporting more vegetation. The Green Sahara became self-sustaining, a stable ecosystem that persisted for thousands of years. The evidence for all this is written in geology, in the layers of sediment at the bottom of ancient lakes, in the chemical signatures trapped in cave formations, in the pollen preserved in deposits across North Africa. Scientists can drill cores into these ancient lake beds and extract cylinders of sediment that represent thousands of years of accumulated material. And in those cores they can see the story. Layers of organic rich sediment from when the lakes were full and productive. Pollen from grasses, from trees, from the plants that grew around the lake shores. Chemical isotopes that tell us about rainfall amounts, about temperature, about the fundamental climate conditions. One of the most dramatic pieces of evidence comes from Lake Mega Chad. Today, Lake Chad is a shallow remnant, barely covering 10,000 square kilometres, and shrinking further with modern climate change and water overuse. But during the African humid period, Mega Chad covered somewhere between 300 and 350,000 square kilometres. That's about the size of Germany, larger than Italy, larger than the entire United Kingdom. This wasn't a lake. This was an inland sea, with shorelines that stretched across what is now some of the most desolate desert on Earth. Imagine standing on the shore of Mega Chad 10,000 years ago. The water extends to the horizon in every direction. Waves lap at sandy beaches. Reed beds sway in the breeze along the shallows. Hippos surface and submerge, their eyes and ears just visible above the water. Crocodiles bask on mud flats. Flocks of water birds, thousands of them, rise and wheel and settle again, feeding on the fish and invertebrates that thrive in these productive waters. Behind you, grasslands stretch away toward distant hills. Herds of antelope graze. Giraffes browse on scattered acacia trees. Elephants move in family groups toward the water to drink. And there are people, your people, let's say. A group of maybe 30 or 40 individuals, extended family, several generations living and working together. Your camp is a semi-permanent settlement near the lake shore, a cluster of structures built from wooden poles and woven grass mats, sturdy enough to last for years. You come back to this place every year after the seasonal movements, following your herds of cattle to different pastures, and then returning when the rains come and the grass grows thick around the lake. The cattle are everything. Your wealth, your food security, your social status, all tied up in how many cattle you own and how well you manage them. They provide milk, which you drink fresh or let ferment into something like yogurt. They provide blood, which you might mix with milk during times when food is scarce. And occasionally, for important ceremonies, or when an animal is too old to keep up with a herd, they provide meat. But mostly you keep them alive, breeding them, growing your herd, increasing your wealth. You know this landscape intimately. You know where the best grazing is in each season. You know which plants are edible for humans, which are poisonous, which have medicinal properties. You know where to find wild honey. You know the animal migrations, when the antelope move north, when the birds arrive from distant lands. This knowledge isn't written down, obviously. Writing doesn't exist yet, but it's preserved in stories, in songs, in the careful teaching from parents to children, from elders to young hunters. And you're creating art. On rock faces near your camp, near sacred sites, images are carved or painted that will survive for thousands of years. The oldest images are of wild animals, the game your grandparents and great-grandparents hunted. But increasingly, the art shows cattle, your cattle, rendered with such care that you can identify the different breeds, see the distinctive horn shapes and body proportions. Some images show herds of hundreds of animals, probably aspirational, showing the wealth that a successful family might accumulate. Others show individual animals, perhaps particularly prized ones, decorated with patterns, maybe wearing ornamental collars. The human figures in the art are doing things. hunting with bows and spears, dancing with arms raised, bodies in motion, women with elaborate hairstyles and jewellery. Some figures are larger than others, probably indicating chiefs or important people. There are scenes that might be religious ceremonies, rows of figures in identical poses, or strange beings that might be gods or spirits. The art isn't just decoration, it's communication, it's history, it's the preservation of cultural knowledge in the only permanent form available. Archaeological excavations at sites across the Sahara have revealed what these people left behind. Pottery, which is remarkable because pottery is heavy and fragile, difficult to transport if you're constantly mobile. The presence of pottery suggests people were staying in place for extended periods, long enough that the benefits of having cookware and storage vessels outweighed the hassle of keeping track of fragile ceramics. Some of this pottery is among the oldest in the world. Sites in the central Sahara, in places like Niger and Libya, have yielded pottery fragments dating back 9 or 10,000 years, contemporary with or even earlier than pottery from the Middle East and East Asia. The pottery styles are sophisticated, not crude bowls, but vessels with elaborate decorations, wavy lines, geometric patterns, sometimes impressions made by pressing cord or basketry into the wet clay before firing. Different regions have different styles, suggesting distinct cultural groups with their own traditions, their own aesthetic preferences, and the presence of different pottery styles at a single site suggests trade, exchange, people from different groups coming together, maybe at seasonal gatherings like the ones that happened at places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey during the same general period. The animal bones found at these sites tell us what people were eating. Cattle, obviously dominating the assemblages at pastoral sites, but also goats and sheep, which are more adaptable to drier conditions, easier to manage in some ways than cattle, and wild game, gazelle bones, antelope, the occasional elephant or giraffe, large game that would have provided enormous amounts of meat and would have been hunted communally, the whole group working together to bring down such dangerous prey. And there's evidence of fishing, not just at the lake shores where you'd expect it, but at sites that are now in the middle of the desert, sites that could only have been occupied when there was water nearby. Fish hooks made from bone, harpoon points, carefully crafted from antelope leg bones, sharpened and carved with barbs so that once they penetrated a fish, it couldn't escape. Net weights, stones with grooves carved around them where cordage would have been tied. These people weren't just spearing fish from the shore, they had sophisticated fishing technology, probably boats, probably complex techniques developed over generations. But the most dramatic evidence comes from locations that today are absolute desert. Places where you need to carry every drop of water you'll consume. Places where nothing grows except maybe a few hardy shrubs surviving in the beds of wadis, dry riverbeds that only flow water once every few years after freak rainstorms. Archaeological surveys in these regions have found evidence of human occupation scattered across vast areas. Stone tools, pottery fragments, animal bones, the remains of hearths where families cooked meals and gathered for warmth during cold desert nights. But these aren't barren deserts in the remains they left. The pollen evidence shows grasslands. The animal bones show species that require permanent water. These sites were occupied when the landscape was fundamentally different, when water was abundant, when life was possible. One of the most remarkable sites is Gobero in Niger, in the Tenere Desert. Today this region receives maybe 5 millimeters of rain per year, barely measurable. Nothing lives there. It's called the Desert of Deserts, empty sand dunes stretching to the horizon. But excavations at Gobero uncovered a cemetery, dozens of burials dating from 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. The skeletons are beautifully preserved in the dry conditions, and they tell us stories. A woman buried with her arms arranged to embrace 2 children, all 3 dying at the same time, maybe from disease or starvation or some accident. But buried with care, with love visible in how the bodies were positioned. The grave goods are revealing, jewellery made from bone and shell, stone tools, pottery, and most tellingly, fish bones and turtle shells buried with some individuals, offerings for the afterlife or symbols of how they lived. These people were fishing and hunting aquatic animals in a place that is now hundreds of kilometres from the nearest permanent water. The cemetery was positioned on what was then the shore of a lake that no longer exists, that hasn't existed for thousands of years, but that during the African humid period was a reliable water source supporting a community for generations. The rock art gives us glimpses of social organisation and belief systems. Some sites show what appear to be masked figures, people wearing elaborate costumes, maybe performing rituals. There are images of what might be gods or spirits, beings with exaggerated features or impossible bodies, human forms with animal heads or geometric patterns where faces should be. This suggests religious practices, belief in supernatural forces, attempts to appeal to or appease the powers that controlled rain and fertility and the success of the herds. Some researchers think they can see evidence of social stratification in the art, certain figures consistently shown larger than others, probably indicating chiefs or important people. Scenes of groups following a single individual suggesting leadership, images of conflict, stick figures with weapons raised against other stick figures, suggesting that these societies weren't always peaceful, that there was competition for resources, territory, status, all the things that humans have always competed over. But mostly, the overwhelming impression from the rock art is of abundance. The sheer number of animal images, the variety of species, the sense that the artists were surrounded by life. This wasn't a harsh environment where people struggled to survive. This was a productive, rich landscape that supported dense populations of both animals and humans. The art celebrates that abundance. Cattle by the hundreds, herds of wild game, scenes of successful hunts, dancing and celebration. This is art created by people who had enough to eat, who had leisure time to devote to creating beauty, who felt secure enough in their existence to invest in permanent works that would outlast them. And this world, this green Sahara with its lakes and rivers and grasslands, lasted for thousands of years. Long enough that multiple cultures rose and fell, long enough that artistic styles evolved and changed, long enough that the people living there had no memory of it ever being different. Their oral histories went back maybe a few generations, maybe stories from great-grandparents about particularly wet years or dry years, but nothing in their cultural memory suggested that the fundamental nature of their world could change. The rains came every year, the grass grew, the cattle thrived, the lakes held water. That was just how the world was, except it wasn't permanent. The orbital mechanics that had created the intense African monsoon were slowly changing. The wobble of Earth's axis was gradually shifting the timing of seasons relative to Earth's orbit around the Sun. Over thousands of years, the summer solar radiation reaching North Africa was decreasing, not dramatically, not in any way that would be noticeable in a single lifetime, but century by century the monsoons were weakening, the rains were becoming slightly less reliable, the dry season was lasting a little longer each year. For most of the African humid period, the system was resilient enough to absorb these small changes. The vegetation feedback loop kept things stable. Even with slightly less rainfall, the grasslands persisted, the trees survived, the lakes remained full, the ecosystem had momentum, it wanted to stay green. But there are thresholds in climate systems, tipping points where small additional changes can trigger rapid transitions to completely different states. And sometime around 6,000 years ago, the Saharan climate system approached one of those thresholds. The transition wasn't immediate. It wasn't 1 year the Sahara was green, and the next it was desert. But it was faster than you might think. Climate records show that the shift from humid to arid conditions in many areas happened over just a few centuries. In the context of the thousands of years the Green Sahara had existed, that's almost instantaneous. And for the people living through it, for the generations who watched their world transform, it must have seemed like the end of everything. The grass dying. The rivers flowing only seasonally, then not at all. The lakes shrinking, their shores retreating, exposing mudflats that cracked and dried in the sun. The animals leaving, following the vegetation south and east toward regions that still had water, and eventually, inevitably, the people leaving too. Because you can't stay where there's no water. You can adapt to a lot. You can change your diet, shift from cattle to goats if the grazing gets worse. You can move your camps more frequently, ranging farther to find good pasture. You can dig deeper wells, exploit groundwater resources. But when the rain stops falling entirely, when the rivers dry up, when the lakes turn to salt flats, there's no adaptation possible. You have to move. And when millions of people across an area the size of a continent all have to move at roughly the same time, all heading toward the remaining water sources, that's when you get a crisis. That's when you get the 5.9 kiloyear event. That's when everything changes. So the question becomes, when did it start? When did the people of the Green Sahara first notice that something was wrong? And here's the thing about slow climate change. It's almost impossible to pinpoint a single moment when everything shifted. There's no day you can circle on a calendar and say this is when the drought began. Instead, it's a gradual accumulation of small changes that individually seem unremarkable, but collectively become catastrophic. The best scientific evidence we have suggests the shift began around 3900 BCE, roughly 5900 years ago. But that date comes from ice cores drilled in Greenland, from ocean sediment cores extracted from the Gulf of Oman, from chemical analysis of cave formations in Israel. It's the date when scientists looking at these records see a clear signal, an unmistakable shift in the isotope ratios and dust concentrations and other proxies that tell us about ancient climate. But the people living through it, they probably couldn't have told you when it started. They just knew that over time, over years and decades, things were getting worse. Imagine you're a child growing up in one of those pastoral communities near Lake Mega Drought around 3900 BCE. Your earliest memories are of the good years, the normal years, the rains coming every summer as they're supposed to, your family's cattle healthy and numerous, the lakeshore close to your camp, an easy walk to fetch water, your parents and the other adults in your group confident, secure, following the seasonal patterns that their parents and grandparents taught them. This is what the world is like. This is how things work. But as you grow, as the years pass, you start to notice things changing. Maybe you're 7 or 8 years old when you first hear the adults talking with concern about the rains. They came late that year. Not catastrophically late, just a few weeks behind schedule. And when they did come, they weren't as heavy as usual. The grass didn't grow as thick. By the end of the dry season, the grazing was poor, and your family had to move the cattle farther from the lake than they usually did to find adequate pasture. But the adults said it was just variation, just one of those things. Some years are wetter, some years are drier, nothing to worry about. Next year would probably be better. Except next year wasn't better. The rains came late again. And the year after that, later still. By the time you're 12 or 13, old enough to take on real responsibilities with the herds, it's obvious that something has changed. The lake shore that used to be a short walk from your camp is now a much longer journey. The water level has dropped enough that you can see the old shoreline, a distinct line on the exposed beach marking where the water used to reach. Your parents point to their camp and say, "When we were children, the water came up to here. Now look how far we have to walk. The cattle are stressed. The grass doesn't grow as thick anymore, and they have to range farther to find enough to eat." Some of the weaker animals die during the dry season. Your family's herd, which was 40 or 50 animals when you were small, is down to 30. And it's not just your family. Everyone's herds are smaller. Everyone's struggling. The adults make decisions. Maybe it's time to move, to find a new territory where the grazing is better, where the water is more reliable. But where? Other families are making the same calculation, and when you travel, you find that the other good camping spots, the places with permanent water, are already occupied. There are more people crowded around the remaining lakes and rivers. Competition for the best grazing land. Tension between groups who used to cooperate, who used to help each other, but who now eye each other with suspicion because there isn't enough for everyone. And every year, it gets a little worse. You're an adult now, with children of your own. Your parents are elders, their hair grey, their bodies worn from a lifetime of work, and they tell you stories about how abundant everything was when they were young, how the grass grew so thick the cattle would get fat just walking through it, how the lake was so close you could hear the waves at night from your camp, how there were so many fish you could catch dinner in an hour. You believe them because you remember some of those things from your own childhood. But your children don't believe you when you tell them the same stories. They've never known abundance. They've only known scarcity, and getting worse every year. This is what 300 years of drought looks like at the human scale. Not one catastrophic year where everything collapses, but generation after generation watching conditions deteriorate, watching the world they know slowly die, making adaptations that work for a while and then stop working, digging deeper wells, moving camps more frequently, shifting from cattle, which need a lot of water and good grazing, to goats, which can survive on less, ranging farther and farther in search of resources, until eventually, for more and more people, the adaptations aren't enough. The only option left is to leave entirely, to abandon the territories your ancestors have lived in for thousands of years and head toward the regions that still have reliable water. The scientific evidence for this slow catastrophe is written in multiple archives, and it's worth understanding where this knowledge comes from, because it's actually fascinating how we know what we know about ancient climate. One of the most important sources is ice cores from Greenland. Scientists have drilled down through the Greenland ice sheet, extracting cores that go back more than 100,000 years. Each layer of ice represents a year of snowfall, and trapped in that ice are bubbles of ancient atmosphere, particles of dust, chemical signatures that tell us about temperature, about atmospheric circulation patterns, about how much dust was blowing around the world. And around 5,900 years ago, the Greenland ice cores show a spike in dust, specifically dust from North Africa. You can tell where dust comes from by its chemical composition, by the isotope ratios of elements like strontium and neodymium. And the dust showing up in Greenland ice from this period has the signature of Saharan soil. Huge amounts of it, far more than in the preceding millennia. This tells us that the Sahara was drying out, that vegetation was dying and soil was being exposed, and wind was picking it up and carrying it thousands of kilometers across the Atlantic. The Green Sahara was turning to dust, literally, and that dust was falling on ice sheets far to the north. Ocean sediment cores tell a similar story. When rivers carry a lot of water, they also carry sediment, soil particles and organic matter washed from the land and deposited where the rivers enter the ocean. Scientists can drill cores from the ocean floor and look at the layers of sediment, analysing what's in each layer and dating them using radiocarbon and other techniques. And in cores from the Gulf of Oman, from the Mediterranean, from off the coast of West Africa, you see a dramatic shift around 5,900 years ago. The sediment changes, less river-transported material, more wind-blown dust. The chemical signatures change, indicating that rivers were flowing less, that vegetation was dying, that the landscape was transitioning from green to brown. Cave formations, things like stalactites and stalagmites, provide another archive. These formations grow as water drips through caves, depositing minerals layer by layer, year by year. The chemical composition of those layers depends on the chemistry of the rainfall that's filtering down through the soil and rock above the cave. When rainfall is abundant, the isotope ratios are different than when rainfall is scarce. Scientists can drill cores through these formations, analyze the chemistry of each layer, and reconstruct rainfall patterns going back thousands of years. And in caves across the Middle East and North Africa, the evidence is consistent. Around 5,900 years ago, rainfall decreased dramatically. Put all these sources together, along with others like ancient lake-level records and pollen analysis and archaeological evidence, and you get a coherent picture. Around 3900 BCE, the African monsoon system weakened significantly. The summer rains that had been penetrating deep into the Sahara started failing. Not completely, not immediately, but year by year, decade by decade, the rainfall decreased. And with less rain came less vegetation, and with less vegetation came less moisture being released back into the atmosphere, and with less atmospheric moisture came even less rainfall. The positive feedback that had sustained the Green Sahara for thousands of years flipped into a negative feedback. The system was collapsing into a new stable state. Desert. But here's what's important to understand. This wasn't happening uniformly across all of North Africa. Some regions were hit harder and faster than others. The Central Sahara, the areas farthest from the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, dried out most dramatically. Lakes in these interior regions shrank rapidly. By 3700 BCE, 200 years into the drought, many of them were gone entirely, leaving salt flats and dust basins where water had existed for millennia. The rock art in these regions stops. The archaeological sites show abandonment. People couldn't live there anymore, so they left. But along the margins, along the southern edge of what's now the Sahel, along the northern coasts, the transition was slower. There was still some rainfall, though less than before. Some rivers kept flowing, though seasonally rather than year-round. Some communities could hang on, adapting their economies, shifting their settlement patterns, making do with less. These became refuge zones, areas where population concentrated as people fled from the drying interior. And that concentration of population created its own problems. More people competing for fewer resources, more tension, more conflict. The archaeological evidence from this period shows stress in almost every form you can measure. Settlement patterns change dramatically. Sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries are suddenly abandoned. You can see it in the stratigraphy, the layers of earth that archaeologists excavate. Layers showing continuous human occupation, Hearths and pottery fragments and animal bones and all the debris of daily life, and then suddenly nothing. An abandonment horizon. And then maybe centuries later, new occupation by different people, with different material culture. At the same time, you see new sites appearing in different locations. Places that weren't occupied before suddenly show human presence. These are typically locations with permanent water sources, springs or rivers, or the shores of lakes that haven't completely dried up yet. Populations are concentrating, crowding into the remaining habitable areas, and the archaeology reflects this crowding. Settlements getting larger, denser occupation, more evidence of social stress. One way archaeologists can detect social stress is through skeletal analysis. Bones preserve evidence of malnutrition, of disease, of violence. And in skeletal remains from sites dating to this period, there's an increase in stress markers. You see evidence of periods of stunted growth, lines in the tooth enamel called enamel hyperplasias that form when a child experiences severe nutritional stress. You see evidence of infectious diseases, inflammations of the bone that indicate chronic illness, and perhaps most tellingly, you see evidence of violence, healed fractures from injuries that weren't accidental, projectile points embedded in bones, signs of conflict between groups competing for scarce resources. This makes sense when you think about the human dynamics. For thousands of years, these pastoral societies had relatively low population density, plenty of space. If you had a dispute with a neighbouring group, you could just move farther away. If grazing was poor in one area, you could shift to a different territory. But as the drought intensified, as habitable land became scarce, mobility stopped being a solution. The remaining good territories were occupied. You couldn't just move somewhere else because everywhere else was either already claimed or uninhabitable. And when you can't move away from conflict, when you're stuck competing with neighbours for the same dwindling resources, violence becomes more likely. The climate records show that the drought wasn't constant in its intensity. There were bad years and slightly less bad years. Brief periods when the rains were a bit better, giving people hope that maybe things were returning to normal, that the crisis was temporary. But then the rains would fail again, sometimes worse than before. This variability might have been even harder to cope with than consistent drought. If it had been clear from the beginning that this was permanent, that the old way of life was over, people could have made decisive choices about leaving, about finding new homes. But the uncertainty, the way some years seemed okay and others were disastrous, that kept people hoping, kept them trying to hang on, kept them from making the difficult decision to abandon their ancestral territories until it was almost too late, until the situation had become desperate. And here's where the human cost becomes almost impossible to comprehend. We're talking about millions of people, maybe tens of millions. Nobody knows exactly how many people lived in the Saharan region during the African humid period, but the archaeological evidence suggests substantial populations spread across vast areas. And over the course of 300 years, all of these people had to make choices. Some chose to stay as long as possible, adapting as best they could, slowly dying out as resources failed. The archaeological record shows some sites with occupations that persist through the early drought period, but become sparser, fewer artifacts, less evidence of activity, until finally there's nothing. These are the populations that didn't make it, that tried to hold on too long and died in place. Others chose to move, and when we look at where the major civilizations emerge or rapidly expand in the centuries after 3900 BCE, we can trace the destinations of these refugees. East toward the Nile Valley, where the river still flowed reliably, fed by rains in the Ethiopian highlands far to the south that weren't as affected by the monsoon failure. South toward the Sahel and the regions beyond where some rainfall persisted. North toward the Mediterranean coast, and east across the Red Sea into Arabia and beyond toward Mesopotamia. Everywhere that still had water received an influx of population, refugees carrying their cultural traditions, their technologies, their genetics into new regions, mixing with established populations or displacing them or conquering them. This is when the map of the ancient world fundamentally redraws itself. For thousands of years, the Sahara had been a population centre, a region of thriving cultures creating art and developing pastoral economies and living sustainably in a productive environment. Within 300 years, it became what it is today, empty, a void on the map, and all those people, all that accumulated cultural knowledge, all those generations of adaptation to Saharan life, had to find new homes, new ways of living, new relationships with landscapes they'd never seen before. Some succeeded in making that transition. Their descendants are the people who built the Bronze Age. Civilizations we'll talk about. But many didn't. They died in the migration, or they died trying to adapt to unfamiliar territories, or they were killed by established populations who saw them as threats. And the world would never be the same. Because those refugee movements, that concentration of population in the remaining habitable zones, created the conditions for the rapid development of complex societies. Cities don't generally emerge from sparse mobile populations. They emerge when you have dense settled populations with no option to disperse. States don't form when people can just leave if they don't like the leadership. They form when people are locked in place, dependent on managed resources like irrigation systems that require coordination and authority. The drought didn't just reshape the climate, it reshaped human society, forcing innovations in organization, in technology, in social complexity that would define civilization for millennia to come. Of all the places that received refugees from the dying Sahara, none was transformed more dramatically than Egypt. And to understand that transformation, to really appreciate how profound it was, you need to remember what Egypt looked like before the drought. A collection of independent villages and small chiefdoms scattered along the Nile, each controlling a stretch of river, each with their own leaders and traditions and local deities. These communities traded with each other, sometimes fought with each other, occasionally cooperated on projects that benefited multiple groups. But they didn't think of themselves as one people. They didn't have a unified identity. There was no Egypt, not yet. The Nile Valley was prosperous, absolutely. The river flooded every year with remarkable reliability, fed by rains far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, rains that weren't directly affected by the monsoon failure that was killing the Sahara. The flood would come in late summer, inundating the fields, depositing rich silt. When the water receded, farmers would plant their crops in that fertile soil. Wheat and barley growing through the mild Egyptian winter, harvested in spring before the brutal summer heat arrived. The system worked beautifully. It had worked for thousands of years, and the population living along the Nile was comfortable, well fed, creating increasingly sophisticated material culture. But the Nile Valley is narrow. Outside the strip of land that the flood reaches, maybe a few kilometers on either side of the river, you're in desert. Absolute desert. Some of the harshest landscape on Earth. So the habitable area of Egypt is actually quite limited. Long, stretching hundreds of kilometers from the Mediterranean coast in the north to the cataracts far to the south where rapids make the river difficult to navigate. But narrow, a ribbon of green in an ocean of sand. And during the African humid period, that desert on either side of the Nile wasn't empty. The eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea, received enough rainfall to support scattered populations. Pastoral groups moving through the wadis, the seasonal valleys where water would flow after rains and vegetation would grow. The western desert, the edge of the Sahara, was even more populated. The rock art evidence shows pastoral societies ranging through regions that are now completely uninhabitable. These desert populations weren't isolated from the Nile Valley. They traded with the river communities, exchanging animal products, hides and milk and meat, for grain and manufactured goods. There was contact, exchange, probably intermarriage. The desert and the river were part of one regional system. But when the drought came, when the rains failed, the deserts on either side of the Nile began to die. Not all at once, but the pattern we talked about before. Grass failing, water sources drying up, herds stressed, population stressed, and the people living in those deserts faced the same choice everyone across the Sahara faced: adapt or leave. And increasingly, the only adaptation that made sense was to move toward the Nile, toward the one source of water in the region that wasn't failing, that was still reliable because it was fed by rains far away. Now imagine you're living in one of the Nile Valley villages around 3700 BCE. Your community has been here for generations. Your family has farmed the same plot of land, the same strip of floodplain, for as long as anyone can remember. You know every palm tree, every irrigation channel, every neighbor. The social order is stable. The local chief is the son of the previous chief from a family that's led your village for 3 or 4 generations. You pay them a portion of your harvest in exchange for protection, for mediation of disputes, for organizing communal projects like maintaining the irrigation channels. It's a system that works. But you're starting to notice changes. Strangers arriving from the desert. Not just a few individuals or a single family, but groups, entire communities showing up looking for land to settle, for access to water. At first, maybe your village accommodates them. There's room after all. The village isn't densely packed. New families can build houses on the edge of the settlement, clear new fields in areas that weren't being farmed. And these newcomers bring useful skills. They're good with animals. They know how to make certain types of pottery that your people don't. They have different stories, different perspectives, but they keep coming, more every year. And the desert communities aren't the only source of new population. People are also arriving from farther west, from the deep Sahara, groups that have been displaced from territories that have become completely uninhabitable. These are people who've already been travelling for years, who've already lost their ancestral lands, who are desperate for somewhere, anywhere, that has water and food, and they're all converging on the Nile Valley because there's nowhere else to go. By the time you're middle-aged, the village you grew up in is unrecognisable. The population has doubled, maybe tripled. Everywhere you look, there are people you don't know. The outskirts of the village have sprawled far beyond the old boundaries. Fields that used to produce surplus are barely producing enough because they've been subdivided among more families. The irrigation channels, which used to be maintained by voluntary labour from the established families, are now contentious. Who has the right to draw water first? The old families who've always been here? The new arrivals who are farming land that was marginal before but is now needed? How do you decide? The social order is straining. Your village chief, who inherited authority through traditional lineage, is finding it harder to maintain control. The newcomers don't have the same loyalty to him. They don't have generations of accumulated obligation and reciprocity. They see him as just another competitor for resources. Disputes that used to be settled through negotiation and appeal to tradition are now escalating into violence. Fights breaking out over water rights, over grazing land for the few cattle and goats people keep, over boundaries between fields. And this isn't just happening in your village, it's happening everywhere along the Nile. The archaeological evidence from this period, from around 3700 to 3300 BCE, shows Egypt transforming rapidly. Settlement patterns change. Villages that were small and dispersed are growing larger, new settlements appearing, and crucially, fortifications start showing up in the archaeological record. Walls being built around villages, not symbolic walls, not the kind of low boundaries that mark territory. Substantial defensive walls, thick mud brick barriers designed to keep people out, to protect the settlement and its stored resources from attack. This is a radical shift. For thousands of years, pre-dynastic Egyptian villages didn't need fortifications. Competition between communities was usually ritualized, managed through displays of prestige or controlled conflicts that didn't threaten whole populations. But now, with population pressure intensifying, with resources becoming scarce relative to the number of people, violence is escalating. The walls are evidence that communities feel threatened, that they need to be able to defend themselves against neighbours who might try to take by force what they can't get through trade or negotiation. The skeletal evidence backs this up. Human remains from this period show increasing signs of violent trauma, healed fractures that suggest combat injuries, unhealed injuries that killed people, projectile points embedded in bone, bodies showing signs of having been killed in violent confrontations. This isn't the occasional murder or personal dispute. This is systematic violence, probably raids between communities, or battles over contested territories. And in response to this violence, in response to the chaos of rapid population growth and competition for resources, something new emerges: centralized authority, strong leaders who can organize defense, who can coordinate irrigation, who can make decisions about resource allocation, and enforce those decisions with the threat of violence. The chiefs who succeed in this new environment aren't necessarily the ones from the oldest, most established families. They're the ones who are effective, who are ruthless when necessary, who can inspire loyalty or fear or both. The archaeological record shows this centralization happening in stages. By 3500 BCE, the landscape of pre-dynastic Egypt is dominated by a smaller number of larger polities. The dozens of independent villages have been consolidated into maybe a dozen major chiefdoms, each controlling substantial stretches of the Nile. This consolidation happened through a combination of alliance and conquest. Some smaller communities voluntarily joined with larger, more powerful neighbours, seeking protection, accepting subordinate status in exchange for security. Others were conquered, their populations absorbed or displaced, their resources taken by stronger groups. The major centers of power during this period have names you might recognize if you know Egyptian history. Hierakonpolis in the south, Upper Egypt, one of the most powerful chiefdoms, Nakada, which gives its name to the archaeological cultures of pre-dynastic Egypt, Abydos, which will become one of the most sacred sites in pharaonic Egypt, and in the north, in the Delta region, other centers emerging, places like Buto and Sais. Each of these centers controlling surrounding territory, each competing with the others for dominance, for control of more of the Nile and its resources. The material culture becomes more elaborate during this period. The elites in these major centers are accumulating wealth on a scale that wasn't possible before. Elaborate burials showing up, tombs filled with grave goods that demonstrate wealth and status. Pottery painted with intricate designs, stone palettes carved with images of animals and humans, jewelry made from semi-precious stones brought from distant sources. These aren't the graves of ordinary farmers. These are elites, people who've accumulated power and wealth, who are starting to distinguish themselves from the rest of the population in dramatic ways. And the art from this period, the imagery, shows what's happening socially. You see depictions of conflict, of violence, of domination. The famous scorpion mace head, named after the scorpion symbol carved on it, shows a figure, probably a king or chief wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, holding a mace standing over bound captives. This is propaganda. This is art designed to communicate power, to show that the person depicted is dominant, is victorious, is someone who controls others through force. You see similar imagery on other objects from this period. Palettes showing rows of bound captives, dead enemies, fortified towns being attacked. This is a society at war with itself, communities and chiefdoms fighting for survival and dominance in an environment where there's not enough for everyone. But here's where it gets interesting. This violence, this competition, this crisis, it's creating something new. Because managing a large chiefdom, coordinating the activities of thousands of people spread across dozens of villages, that requires administration. You need people keeping track of resources, making sure grain from the harvest is collected and stored and distributed appropriately. You need managers organizing irrigation projects, making sure channels are maintained, making sure water is allocated fairly, or at least in ways that maintain social order. You need record keeping, and this is when we start seeing the earliest evidence of Egyptian writing. Not fully developed hieroglyphics yet, but proto-writing. Labels on pottery jars indicating what's inside, who it belongs to. Symbols carved on ivory tags attached to grave goods or trade items. These aren't literary texts, they're administrative tools, ways of tracking property and resources in societies that have become too large and complex for everything to be managed through personal relationships and oral tradition. The Nama palette, one of the most famous artifacts from this period, dated to around 3100 BCE, shows how far this process has gone. On one side, you see Nama, the king, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, about to strike a kneeling captive with a mace. Behind the captive, hieroglyphic symbols that might be place names, indicating conquered territories. On the other side, Nama is wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, walking among rows of decapitated enemies. And in smaller registers, you see symbols of conquered towns, dead bodies, bound prisoners. This isn't just art. This is a historical document, recording Nama's victories, his unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. Whether Nama was actually the first pharaoh, the one who truly unified Egypt, or whether that's a later tradition, a story that simplified a more complex process, scholars debate. Some think there was a king before Nama, someone called Scorpion, who began the unification. Others think Nama and Menes, the name given in later Egyptian king lists to the first pharaoh, are the same person. The details don't matter as much as the pattern. Sometime around 3100 BCE, within a few centuries of when the drought crisis really intensified, Egypt went from being a collection of competing chiefdoms to being a unified state under a single ruler. And that unification wasn't some peaceful federation. The imagery makes it clear. This was conquest. This was one chiefdom, probably based in Upper Egypt in the south, systematically conquering its rivals, absorbing them into a single political structure, imposing centralized authority. The king who achieved this, whether it was Nama or someone else, commanded armies. He had administrative apparatus sophisticated enough to manage territories hundreds of kilometers long. He claimed divine authority, associating himself with the gods, particularly Horus, the falcon god, presenting himself not just as a political leader, but as a sacred figure whose rule was ordained by supernatural powers. And here's the thing. This probably wouldn't have happened without the drought. Think about the counterfactual. If the Sahara had remained green, if the deserts on either side of the Nile had continued supporting their pastoral populations, would Egypt have unified? Probably not. The pressure wouldn't have been there. The Nile Valley communities were doing fine before the refugee crisis. They were prosperous, stable, not particularly motivated to conquer each other. The cost of warfare, the risk, it wouldn't have been worth it when there was enough for everyone. But the drought changed the equation. Suddenly there wasn't enough for everyone. Suddenly the Nile Valley was crowded with displaced populations, desperate for land and water. Suddenly competition was intense, existential. The communities that could organize effectively, that could defend their resources and take resources from others, those communities survived and grew stronger. The ones that couldn't, that remained small and disorganized, were absorbed or destroyed. Natural selection operating at the level of political organization. And the end result was a state, a unified kingdom, because only that level of organization could manage the crisis. The irrigation systems became more elaborate during this period because they had to. With more people depending on the same floodplain, you couldn't just let the floodwater spread naturally. You needed to control it, direct it, make sure it reached all the fields efficiently. That required canals, basins, coordinated labor, and that required authority. Someone had to organize the work crews, had to decide which fields got water first, had to resolve disputes. The pharaohs, the early kings of unified Egypt, derived much of their power from controlling irrigation. They presented themselves as the ones who made the Nile flood happen, who ensured the fertility of the land through their relationship with the gods. And practically, they controlled the infrastructure that made agriculture productive. This is the birth of the Egypt you know from history books, from hieroglyphs and pyramids and pharaohs. The first dynasty, beginning around 3100 BCE, marks the start of what Egyptologists call the early dynastic period. Within a few generations, these kings are building elaborate tombs at Abydos and Saqqara. They're developing a full writing system, hieroglyphics that can express complex ideas, not just label jars. They're establishing the bureaucratic structure that will characterize Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years, a class of scribes and administrators managing the state's resources, collecting taxes, organizing labor, keeping records. The Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, is just a few centuries away. By 2600 BCE, the pharaohs will be building monuments like the Great Pyramid of Giza, structures so massive they required the organized labor of thousands, so precisely engineered they still stun us today. But those pyramids, that extraordinary civilization, they're built on a foundation laid during the crisis. The administrative systems, the centralized authority, the ideological framework that made pharaonic power possible, all of that emerged in response to the chaos and pressure of the drought years. And the population that built Old Kingdom Egypt, the genetic ancestry of those people, it's a mixture. Archaeological genetics, analysis of DNA from ancient skeletons, shows that the population of Egypt during this period includes people with ancestry from across North Africa, from the Sahara, from the Levant to the east. This isn't surprising. Egypt became a refuge zone, absorbing displaced populations from across the region. Those refugees didn't replace the existing population. They mixed with them, intermarried, brought their cultural traditions and technologies, and blended them with what was already there. Some of the artistic traditions of pharaonic Egypt, the way animals are depicted, the symbolic systems, these have roots in Saharan rock art. You can see the continuity, the shared aesthetic, suggesting that people from the Sahara brought their artistic traditions to the Nile Valley, and those traditions influenced or merged with existing Egyptian art. Some of the religious concepts, the emphasis on cattle, the importance of pastoral symbolism even in an agricultural society, these might reflect the integration of pastoral peoples from the deserts into Egyptian culture. But integration is probably too gentle a word for what happened. This was also displacement, conquest, the established Nile Valley populations being overwhelmed in some areas, fighting back in others. The violence we see in the archaeological record wasn't one-sided. Everyone was fighting, everyone was competing, and the people who ended up on top, who became the elite of unified Egypt, were the ones who were most effective at that competition, most ruthless, most successful at accumulating and wielding power. The Egypt that emerged from this crisis was dramatically different from the Egypt that existed before. More centralized, more hierarchical, more militarized. The early pharaohs maintained standing armies, something that pre-dynastic chiefdoms hadn't needed. They built elaborate fortifications, not just around settlements, but along Egypt's borders, particularly to the south where they faced other kingdoms in Nubia. They developed increasingly sophisticated administrative systems to track and control, resources, to organize labor, to extract surplus from the population to fund monumental building projects and military campaigns. And they developed an ideology, a belief system, that justified all of this. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was a god, or at least semi-divine, the intermediary between humanity and the cosmic forces that controlled the world. His rule wasn't subject to negotiation, it was sacred, ordained, essential for maintaining order, for keeping chaos at bay. This ideology was incredibly powerful, lasting for millennia, shaping how Egyptians understood their world and their place in it. None of this was inevitable. If the climate had remained stable, if the Sahara had stayed green, the trajectory of Egyptian history would have been completely different. Maybe the small chiefdoms would have eventually consolidated into larger kingdoms through some other process. Maybe not. We'll never know. What we do know is that the drought, the refugee crisis, the population pressure, these created the conditions where rapid, dramatic political centralization happened. Where unified Egypt emerged not over thousands of years but over a few centuries, where the pharaohs came to power not through gradual cultural evolution, but through conquest and crisis. The drought didn't create Egyptian civilization. The people did that, with their ingenuity and adaptability and ruthlessness and vision. But the drought created the pressure, the urgency, the necessity. It forced innovation. It forced change. And the result was one of the most enduring, most spectacular civilizations in human history. A civilization built, in a very real sense, by climate refugees. While Egypt was being forced into unity by the crisis, something very different was happening in Mesopotamia. And to understand why, you need to appreciate how sophisticated the Mesopotamian world had become before the drought, how far the reach of its cities and its cultural influence extended. Because Mesopotamia in 4000 BCE wasn't just the southern river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates. It was a network, a cultural sphere that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, connecting the irrigated agricultural heartland in the south with colonies and trading posts scattered throughout the Fertile Crescent. This expansion is called the Uruk period, named after the great city that was its center. Uruk, which we talked about earlier, was enormous by the standards of the time. 20,000 people or more living in a densely packed urban center. And Uruk wasn't just big, it was culturally dominant, setting styles and standards that influenced communities across a vast region. The pottery made in Uruk, distinctive beveled rim bowls used probably for rations, these show up at sites hundreds of kilometers away. The architectural styles developed in Uruk, massive temples built on platforms, these get copied in distant settlements. The administrative technologies, the proto-writing systems using clay tokens and cylinder seals, these spread far beyond the city itself. But the most dramatic evidence of Uruk's influence comes from the colonies. Starting around 3400 BCE, maybe slightly earlier, Uruk and other southern Mesopotamian cities established outposts throughout the north. Not just trading contacts, but actual settlements where southern Mesopotamians went to live, bringing their material culture, their architecture, their economic systems. These colonies appear in Syria, along the upper reaches of the Euphrates River. They appear in southeastern Turkey. They appear in the Zagros Mountains to the east. Everywhere that had resources the south needed, timber, metals, semi-precious stones, you find evidence of southern Mesopotamian presence. Some of these colonies were substantial. Tel Brak in northeastern Syria might have been home to 20,000 people at its peak, rivaling Uruk itself in size. The city had massive public buildings, temples and administrative complexes built in the southern Mesopotamian style. It had specialized craft production, workshops producing pottery and textiles and metal goods. It was fully urban, fully sophisticated, a northern outpost of the Uruk world. Hamukar, another Syrian site, shows similar development. Dense occupation, fortification walls, public architecture. These weren't just trading posts, these were cities, and they were all connected to the south through trade networks, through administrative ties, through cultural affiliation. Resources would flow south to Uruk and the other cities. Finished goods, textiles, and pottery and prestige items would flow north. The whole system worked as an integrated economic network, with the southern cities as the core and the northern colonies as the periphery extracting resources and perhaps also serving as gateways to even more distant trade. But here's the crucial thing about these northern colonies. They depended on rainfall agriculture. Unlike the southern cities, which were located in a region so dry that farming required irrigation, the north got enough rain to grow crops without artificial water management. Winter rains would fall, soaking the soil. Farmers would plant wheat and barley after the rains, and the residual moisture in the soil would carry the crops through to harvest in spring. It was simpler than irrigation, required less labour, less organisation. You just needed the rain to come reliably enough. And for most of the 4th millennium BCE, it did. The northern Fertile Crescent was productive, capable of supporting dense populations, capable of generating surpluses that fed the urban centres and supported the specialised economies. The whole Uruk expansion was possible because the north could produce food, lots of it, enough for the thousands of people living in places like Tel Brak and Hamuka. But when the drought came, when the 5.9 kiloyear event disrupted climate patterns, across the Middle East the northern Mesopotamian system collapsed. The rain-fed agricultural zone, which stretched in an arc from the Levant through Syria and northern Iraq into western Iran, this entire region experienced dramatic reductions in rainfall. The same climate shifts that were killing the Sahara were also affecting the Middle East. The westerly winds that brought winter rains to the Fertile Crescent weakened. The rainfall became less reliable, less abundant. And without reliable rain, rain-fed agriculture failed. Imagine you're living in Tel Brak around 3800 BCE. Your city has been thriving for centuries. 20,000 people, maybe more, living in a dense urban core surrounded by agricultural hinterlands that produce the grain to feed everyone. Your family might be craftspeople, making pottery in workshops that supply markets across the region. Or maybe you're part of the administrative apparatus, working in one of the temples that manage the city's economic affairs. Or perhaps you're a farmer living in one of the villages surrounding the city, bringing your harvest to the central granaries where it's recorded and redistributed. The first year the rains fail, it's concerning but not catastrophic. You've seen bad years before, the next year will probably be better. The administrators open the city's grain reserves, distribute stored food to get through the shortage. But the next year isn't better. The rains come late and light. The harvest is poor again. And the year after that, even worse. Within a decade, it's clear this isn't just variation. Something fundamental has changed. The rains that used to be reliable aren't anymore. The fields that used to produce abundant harvests are producing less and less. The city starts to strain. The population, which had been stable or growing, starts to decline. Some families leave, heading south toward regions where irrigation makes agriculture possible even without rain. Others try to hang on, but food is increasingly scarce and expensive. The markets that used to bustle with trade are quieter. The workshops that used to employ dozens of craftspeople are laying people off because there's no surplus to support specialised labour anymore. Everyone who can needs to be producing food, but even with everyone farming, there isn't enough because the rain isn't falling. The archaeological record shows this collapse happening with shocking speed. Tel Brak, which had been continuously occupied and thriving for centuries, shows a dramatic decline in the late 4th millennium BCE. The dense urban occupation thins out. The public buildings stop being maintained. The specialised craft production diminishes. By 3600 BCE, maybe 3500, the site is essentially abandoned. 20,000 people, gone. Not dead necessarily, probably mostly migrated to other regions, but the city, empty, a ghost town, and Tel Brak wasn't unique. Across northern Mesopotamia and Syria, you see the same pattern. Sites that had been major centres suddenly show abandonment or dramatic population decline. Hamuka, substantially reduced in size. Smaller settlements throughout the region, abandoned entirely. The archaeological surveys that map ancient settlements across these regions show a clear pattern. In the early 4th millennium, dense settlement throughout the northern zone. By the mid to late 4th millennium, huge gaps, vast areas that were occupied before but are now empty. This is what archaeologists call the Uruk contraction, the network of colonies and settlements that southern Mesopotamian culture had established across the north collapses. The trade routes that connected these regions break down. The cultural sphere that Uruk had dominated fragments, and the question is, what happened to all those people? Where did they go? Many of them went south, back to the core cities, to Uruk and Ur and Eridu and the other urban centres in southern Mesopotamia. These cities, which had been large before, become enormous. Uruk might have reached 40,000 people or more in the centuries following the northern collapse. This isn't just natural population growth, this is refugee absorption, people fleeing from the failing north, concentrating in the south where irrigation made agriculture possible even during the drought. But here's the thing about southern Mesopotamia. It's not an easier environment than the north. In some ways, it's harder. The region is so dry that without irrigation you can't grow crops at all. The annual rainfall is negligible, maybe 100 to 200 millimeters per year, far below what wheat and barley need. So farming requires intensive labor, requires building and maintaining irrigation systems, requires managing water carefully. The South had been doing this for millennia, had developed the expertise and the infrastructure. But supporting a suddenly enlarged population that created enormous pressures. More people meant you needed more fields under cultivation. More fields meant you needed more extensive irrigation systems. More complex irrigation meant you needed better organization, more administration, more centralized control. You couldn't just have individual farmers managing their own small channels anymore. You needed someone coordinating the whole system, deciding how water would be allocated, organizing the labor to dig new canals and maintain existing ones, resolving disputes when multiple fields needed water at the same time. This is when the temple economies of southern Mesopotamia really take off. Temples had always been important. Religious centers, economic hubs managing agricultural land and collecting offerings. But in the late 4th millennium, as the population concentrates and irrigation becomes more critical, the temples become essentially the central administrators of the entire economy. They own vast estates. They employ thousands of workers. They manage the irrigation systems. They store grain in massive granaries and redistribute it as rations to workers and as seed for the next planting season. And this creates something unprecedented. A fully administered economy where a substantial portion of the population isn't producing their own food, but working for institutions that pay them in rations. You might be a labourer digging irrigation canals. You show up for work, you're organised into crews, you're given tools, and assigned a section of canal to dig or clean. At the end of the day, or the week or the month, you receive your ration. So many litres of grain, maybe some oil, maybe beer. You take that home to your family and that's how you survive. You're not a farmer, you're not self-sufficient. You're a wage labourer in an institutional economy. This requires record keeping on a scale that had never been necessary before. The administrators need to track how much grain is stored, how much is being distributed as rations, how much seed is being kept for planting, who's working which fields, who's owed what payment. The clay token system that had been used for simpler accounting isn't adequate anymore. There's too much information, too many transactions, too much complexity. And this is when writing happens. Real writing, not just symbols on pottery jars, cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay tablets with a reed stylus, begins to appear around 3200 BCE. The earliest texts we have are exactly what you'd expect. Administrative records, tablets listing quantities of grain, numbers of workers, allocations of rations, lists of sheep, of fields, of resources being managed by the temple institutions. These aren't literature. They're not poetry or history or religious texts, though those will come later. They're accounting. The world's first writing is essentially bookkeeping, invented because the administrators couldn't keep track of everything in their heads anymore. And once you have writing, once you have this technology for recording information, it opens up new possibilities. You can have contracts that outlast individual memory. You can have laws that apply to everyone and are recorded permanently. You can have correspondence, messages sent between cities or between officials. Writing becomes a tool of power, a way of organizing society at scales that were impossible before. The scribes, the people trained to read and write, become an elite class. Literacy is rare, specialized, valuable. And the institutions that control literacy, primarily the temples but increasingly also palaces as kings emerge, these institutions gain enormous power. The southern Mesopotamian cities during this period are developing all the hallmarks of what we'd recognize as civilization. Monumental architecture, ziggurats rising above the cities, massive platforms topped with temples. Social stratification, with clear differences between elites and commoners, between landowners and labourers, between literate scribes and illiterate workers. Specialised professions, not just farmers and craftspeople, but priests and administrators and soldiers. Legal systems, early law codes establishing rules for trade, for property, for justice, and writing, the technology that makes all of this administrable, that allows complex societies to function at unprecedented scales. But this rapid development came at a cost. The social world became more unequal. In earlier periods, when communities were smaller and most people produced their own food, wealth differences existed, but they were relatively modest. Now, with large populations dependent on institutions for survival, with some people controlling vast resources and others owning almost nothing, inequality became structural. You had rich elites living in large houses with elaborate possessions, and you had labourers living in small, simple dwellings, working for rations with no real property. You also had increasing conflict. The southern cities competed with each other for resources, for control of the best agricultural land, for access to trade routes. They built fortifications, trained armies, fought wars. The peaceful cooperation that might have characterized earlier periods gave way to militarization. Success meant being able to defend your resources and take resources from neighbors. The strong cities absorbed the weak, and power concentrated in the hands of leaders who could organize violence effectively. The city-state system that would characterize Sumerian civilization for the next 1,000 years emerged during this period. Each major city, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, functioned as an independent political entity with its own ruler, its own armies, its own economic systems. They fought with each other constantly, wars over water rights, over boundaries, over prestige. But they also shared a common culture, a common language, Sumerian, which isn't related to any other known language and remains mysterious in its origins. They worshipped the same gods, though different cities had different patron deities. They used the same writing system, the same legal concepts, the same architectural styles. And they were all, in a sense, children of the crisis. The concentration of population that made these cities so large that came from the northern collapse, from refugees fleeing the failing rain-fed agricultural zones. The intensive irrigation agriculture that sustained them, that was necessary because of the drought, because rainfall couldn't be relied upon. The administrative complexity, the writing, the social hierarchy, all of this emerged in response to the pressures of managing large populations in a challenging environment during a period of climate stress. The Sumerian civilization that would produce the Epic of Gilgamesh, that would develop sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, that would build the first law codes and the first schools, this civilization had its roots in the drought years. The crisis didn't create Sumerian culture, obviously. The people did that, with their creativity and ingenuity and accumulated knowledge. But the crisis shaped how that culture developed, what forms it took, what problems it was designed to solve. And there's a profound irony here. The north collapsed because it depended on rain, and the rain failed. The south survived because it had never depended on rain, because the environment was so harsh that irrigation had always been necessary. The adaptation to scarcity, the infrastructure built to cope with an unforgiving climate that became an advantage when conditions worsened. The South had already solved the water problem. They had the systems, the expertise, the social organization to manage agriculture in a dry environment. So when the drought came, they could absorb refugees, expand their systems, grow larger and more complex. But they were also locked into a trajectory that would define Mesopotamian history for millennia. Dependence on irrigation meant dependence on centralized authority. You can't have irrigation without organization, without someone managing the systems, and that creates power dynamics that are hard to escape. The institutions that control water control everything. The southern cities would never develop the kind of individual autonomy, the freedom that might have existed in smaller, rain-fed agricultural communities. They would always be hierarchical, always be administered, always have elites and laborers and systems of control. The archaeological evidence from this transitional period, from 3800 to 3200 BCE, shows all of this happening. Northern abandonment, southern expansion, development of complex administrative systems, the appearance of writing, increasing social stratification, militarization, All within a few centuries, the same pattern we saw in Egypt, though with regional variations, with different specific outcomes. Crisis driving rapid social change, forcing innovations in organisation and technology, creating new forms of complexity. And the memory of this crisis, of the northern collapse and the southern concentration, might be preserved in Sumerian mythology. The flood myths that are so prominent in Mesopotamian literature, stories like the Epic of Atrahasis or the flood narrative that influenced the biblical story of Noah, these might contain echoes of the climate catastrophes that reshaped the region. The stories talk about divine decisions to reduce human population, about catastrophic environmental changes, about the world being remade. Whether these specifically reference the 5.9 kiloyear event or later droughts or other disasters, we can't know for certain. But it's striking that the civilizations that emerged from this crisis period developed mythologies centered on cosmic catastrophe and survival, on the world ending and being rebuilt. The Mesopotamian world after the drought was fundamentally different from before. Geographically smaller in its core, no longer stretching across the entire Fertile Crescent, but concentrated in the southern river valleys, but culturally richer, more complex, more sophisticated in its organizational technologies. The cities were larger, the economies more specialized, the social structures more elaborate, and the foundation was laid for everything that would come after, for the Akkadian Empire that would unite Mesopotamia under a single ruler within a few centuries, for the Babylonian civilization that would produce Hammurabi's law code, for the Assyrian Empire that would dominate the ancient Middle East. All of that emerged from the crisis, from the adaptation to catastrophe, from the survivors who rebuilt in the irrigated south after the northern world collapsed. The drought wasn't just reshaping Egypt and Mesopotamia. Those are the regions we know most about because they developed writing, because they left extensive archaeological records, because their civilizations endured and became famous. But the climate crisis was affecting people across a much wider geography. From the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the mountains of Iran, from the Arabian Peninsula to the Caucasus, millions of people were experiencing the same thing. Their world was dying. The water was disappearing, and they had to move or perish. This was the greatest migration in ancient history. Not a single wave of people moving from one place to another, but dozens of separate movements happening simultaneously, or in overlapping waves across thousands of kilometers. Different groups making different choices, heading in different directions, encountering different obstacles, experiencing different fates. Some found new homes and integrated into existing populations. Some conquered territories and displaced the people who were already there. And some simply died, leaving barely any trace in the archaeological record except perhaps a few artifacts scattered across landscapes they couldn't cross. Let's start with the most obvious movements, the ones we've already touched on. The Saharan pastoralists abandoning their drying territories and moving toward the Nile Valley. But that movement wasn't uniform, wasn't a single coordinated migration. It happened in stages, over generations, with different groups making the decision to leave at different times depending on local conditions and individual circumstances. The people living in the central Sahara, in the regions farthest from any permanent water sources, they probably left first. As early as 4000 BCE, maybe even earlier, you start seeing abandonment of interior sites. The rock art stops being created. The pottery assemblages end. The archaeological signatures of human presence just disappear. These people couldn't wait for conditions to improve because there was no margin for error in the deep desert. When the rains failed, when the lakes dried up, survival became impossible within a single generation, so they moved, probably heading east toward the Nile or south toward regions that retained more rainfall. But the people living on the margins, near the edges of what would remain habitable, they might have held on much longer. Moving isn't a simple decision. You're abandoning territories your ancestors lived in for generations. You're leaving behind sacred sites, burial grounds, the physical landmarks that carry your cultural memory. You're risking the journey, which could be dangerous, could fail, and you're uncertain about what reception you'll get at your destination. Will existing populations welcome you? Will they tolerate you? Will they fight you? So you delay, you adapt, you hope things will improve. Until they don't. Until staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. The genetic evidence from modern populations and from ancient DNA extracted from archaeological skeletons shows this movement clearly. People living in Egypt today, Their ancestry isn't just from the Nile Valley populations that were there in pre-dynastic times. There's substantial contribution from populations that originated in other parts of North Africa, from the Sahara, from the Maghreb to the west, and the admixture happens during this period. The centuries around 4000 to 3000 BCE show up in genetic studies as a time of population movement and mixing. But genetics can only tell you so much. It can tell you that populations mixed, that people with different ancestries came together and had children. It can't tell you whether that mixing was peaceful or violent, whether it was integration or conquest, whether both groups benefited or one dominated the other. For that you need archaeology. And the archaeology suggests it was complicated, that all of those things happened in different places at different times. Some Nile Valley sites show gradual cultural change, pottery styles slowly incorporating elements from Saharan traditions, suggesting peaceful integration, intermarriage, cultural exchange. Other sites show more abrupt changes, old styles disappearing and new styles appearing suddenly, suggesting population replacement, perhaps violent. And many sites show evidence of conflict, fortification walls going up, violence increasing, skeletal remains showing trauma. The newcomers weren't always welcome. Resources were limited, and established populations often resisted the influx. Now shift your perspective east. The Arabian Peninsula, which today is mostly desert, extremely harsh, almost uninhabitable except along the coasts and in a few highland areas. During the African humid period, parts of Arabia were more livable. Not lush exactly, but with enough rainfall to support scattered pastoral populations, with seasonal lakes and rivers that flowed after rains. The same monsoon system that greened the Sahara brought some moisture to Arabia, particularly the southern and western regions. But when the monsoon failed, Arabia dried, out just like the Sahara, and the people living there faced the same choice. The archaeological record from Arabia is harder to read than from North Africa, partly because there's been less research, partly because the environment is harsher and preserves less. But the evidence we have shows abandonment. Sites occupied during the mid-Holocene showing human presence, pastoralism, stone tool production. These sites end. The occupations stop. And the next time you see dense settlement in many of these regions, it's much later, after populations have adapted to the extreme desert conditions or after climate improved slightly. Where did the Arabian populations go? Some probably moved to the coasts, to the Persian Gulf shore, to the Red Sea coast, where fishing and maritime resources could supplement declining terrestrial resources. Others probably moved northeast toward Mesopotamia, joining the refugee streams heading toward the river valleys. Still others might have moved south toward Yemen and Oman, where highland areas retained slightly more rainfall. The genetic evidence from modern populations suggests movement in all these directions, though disentangling exactly when each movement happened is difficult. And then there's the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast, the region that includes modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. This region was affected by the drought, but not as catastrophically as the deep Sahara or the Arabian interior. Rainfall decreased, agricultural productivity declined, but the region didn't become completely uninhabitable. What happened here was probably more nuanced. Some internal movement as populations concentrated in the areas that retained the best resources, some immigration from drying regions to the east and south, some emigration toward Mesopotamia or Egypt where larger cities offered opportunities. The archaeological record from the Levant during this period shows significant cultural changes, new pottery styles appearing, new settlement patterns, some sites being abandoned while others grow larger, evidence of increasing trade connections with both Egypt and Mesopotamia, suggesting the region was functioning as a bridge, a corridor where people and goods and ideas moved in multiple directions. The Levant had always been a crossroads, and during the migration crisis that role intensified. Farther north and east, in Anatolia, modern Turkey, the picture is complex. Parts of Anatolia were affected by decreasing rainfall, particularly the southern and eastern regions. But the northern coast along the Black Sea and the western coast, along the Aegean, retained adequate rainfall. What you see archaeologically is a shift in settlement patterns, populations moving from the interior toward the coasts, from the drier southeast toward the wetter northwest, and possibly emigration from Anatolia toward the Balkans and southeastern Europe. Though dating these movements precisely is challenging, this is where things get really interesting and really speculative. Some linguists and archaeologists think the 5.9 kiloyear event might be connected to the spread of Indo-European languages. The Indo-European language family includes most European languages, Persian, Hindi, and many others. And there's a long-standing debate about where the original Indo-European speakers came from, and when and how their languages spread across such a vast area. One theory, the steppe hypothesis, suggests Indo-European speakers originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea and spread outward beginning around 3000 to 2500 BCE, coinciding with the domestication of horses and the development of wheeled vehicles. But other researchers have suggested earlier dates, earlier movements, possibly triggered by climate events. If populations in Anatolia or the Caucasus or Iran were displaced by drought conditions, some of them might have moved north into the steppes or west into Europe, carrying their languages with them. This is speculative. The linguistic and genetic and archaeological evidence is complex and contradictory in places, but it's at least plausible that the 5.9 kiloyear event triggered population movements that eventually contributed to the Indo-European dispersals. Climate doesn't cause language spread directly, but it can cause population movements, and population movements can result in language replacement or mixing. The timing is suggestive, though far from proven. What's less speculative is the evidence for violence during this period. Across the entire region affected by the drought, from North Africa to the Middle East to Iran and Central Asia, the archaeological record shows increased conflict. This makes sense. When resources are scarce and populations are mobile, competition intensifies. Groups arriving at new territories often encounter resistance from established populations. Disputes over water rights, grazing land, agricultural fields, these could escalate into violence when there was no authority structure to mediate conflicts, when both sides were desperate. Skeletal analysis from sites across this region shows increasing evidence of trauma during the late 4th millennium BCE. Healed fractures from injuries sustained in fights, unhealed wounds that killed people, projectile points embedded in bones, arrows or spears that struck and were never removed, defensive wounds on forearms where people tried to block attacks, signs of massacres, multiple individuals buried together showing similar violent deaths, suggesting raids or battles. One particularly striking example comes from a site in Syria, where archaeologists found a mass grave containing dozens of individuals, men, women and children, all showing signs of violent death. Smashed skulls, severed limbs, bodies thrown into a pit without the careful burial treatment that would indicate respect or mourning. This looks like the aftermath of a raid, a group being killed and disposed of by their attackers. And this isn't unique. Similar mass burials showing evidence of violence appear at multiple sites across the region during this period. But violence wasn't the only story. There's also clear evidence of integration, of different populations finding ways to coexist. Pottery styles showing blending of traditions, some vessels with characteristics of multiple cultural groups, suggesting craftspeople learning from each other or communities merging. Burial practices incorporating elements from different traditions, genetic evidence of intermarriage, populations mixing over generations. The archaeological record preserves both the conflict and the cooperation, and probably both were happening simultaneously, different outcomes in different places depending on local circumstances. Some migrations were clearly more successful than others. The movements toward the Nile Valley and toward southern Mesopotamia, toward regions that retained reliable water, these resulted in large, enduring populations. The genetic and archaeological signatures of these migrations are clear and substantial. Other movements, toward more marginal areas or areas that were already densely populated, these might have resulted in smaller groups that were absorbed or disappeared. The archaeological signature is fainter, harder to detect, and some migrations probably failed entirely, groups attempting to cross harsh terrain and not making it, dying en route, leaving no trace except perhaps scattered artifacts in uninhabitable deserts. The human cost of all this is impossible to calculate. How many people died during the drought and the migrations it triggered? We'll never know. The archaeological record can show us patterns, can show us abandonment and violence and stress, but it can't give us body counts. Hundreds of thousands certainly, possibly millions. People dying from starvation as food resources failed, dying from thirst when water sources dried up, dying from disease as crowding and stress weakened immune systems and facilitated epidemic spread, dying from violence as competition for resources turned deadly, And even for those who survived, the trauma must have been extraordinary. Imagine spending your entire childhood watching your world deteriorate, watching your parents and grandparents struggle with increasing desperation, watching siblings die from hunger or disease. Imagine making the decision to leave, abandoning everything familiar, walking for weeks or months toward an uncertain destination. Imagine arriving and being unwelcome, being seen as a threat or a burden, having to fight or negotiate or beg for the right to stay. Imagine the cultural loss, the traditions and knowledge and languages that disappeared as groups fragmented and mixed, and were absorbed into larger populations. And yet, somehow, through all this catastrophe and displacement, culture persisted. People brought their stories with them, their artistic traditions, their knowledge of plants and animals and technologies. The migrations weren't just destructive, they were also vectors of cultural exchange, mixing populations that had been isolated, spreading innovations, creating new hybrid cultures that blended elements from multiple sources. The civilizations that emerged after the drought, in Egypt and Mesopotamia and elsewhere, they weren't purely indigenous developments. They were products of mixing, of refugee populations bringing new ideas and technologies and perspectives, and combining them with what already existed. The pottery from this period shows this mixing beautifully. You can trace styles spreading across vast distances, appearing suddenly at sites far from their origin, suggesting potters moving or ideas travelling through trade networks, or immigrants introducing techniques to new regions. The same with metallurgy, with textile production, with agricultural practices. The crisis accelerated cultural exchange because it forced populations into contact, made previously isolated groups neighbours, created conditions where sharing knowledge became essential for survival, and language must have been fascinating during this period. Imagine being a child growing up in a community where half the families speak one language and half speak another, where adults are constantly translating, where new words are being borrowed constantly to describe new things or new situations. Within a generation or two, you'd have new languages emerging, creoles blending elements of multiple sources, or one language dominating but incorporating substantial vocabulary from others. This is how languages evolve rapidly, through population contact and mixing. And the migrations triggered by the drought created exactly these conditions across a huge area. The archaeological evidence suggests that by about 3500 BCE, maybe 300 years into the crisis, the major migrations were largely complete. Not because conditions had improved, but because populations had reached new equilibria. The habitable zones were occupied densely in some cases. The uninhabitable zones had been abandoned. People were no longer mobile, no longer looking for better territories, because there were no better territories to find. What you had was a new map of human settlement, fundamentally different from 4000 BCE. Population concentrated along the major rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. Sparse populations in marginal zones that retained enough rainfall for subsistence, and vast empty areas, the deep Sahara, the Arabian interior, that had been depopulated and wouldn't support substantial human settlement again until much later, if at all. This new geography would structure human history for millennia. The river valley civilizations would become the centers of power, of cultural development, of technological innovation. The desert regions would become barriers, zones that armies and traders crossed but didn't occupy, that isolated different civilizations from each other, or channeled contact along specific routes. The population distribution established during the drought crisis set the pattern for the Bronze Age and beyond. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because once the migration settled, once populations stabilized in their new territories, they faced a different challenge. How do you survive in these crowded, resource-limited environments? How do you organize societies of tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of people? How do you manage irrigation systems, coordinate labor, resolve disputes, defend resources against competitors? The crisis had forced people together. Now they had to figure out how to live together, and that required innovation, social and technological innovations that would define civilization for the next 5,000 years. So there you are, 3500 BCE. The migrations have mostly happened. Your family, your community, whoever your ancestors were in this period, they've settled somewhere. Maybe in the Nile Valley, part of the swelling population that's transforming Egypt. Maybe in southern Mesopotamia, crowded into Uruk or Ur or one of the other river cities, maybe in the Indus Valley, where similar processes are beginning, though they'll take a few more centuries to fully develop. Maybe in some other region, Anatolia or the Levant or Iran, adapting to change conditions in whatever way seems most likely to keep you and your children alive. And everywhere, people are facing the same fundamental problem. There are too many of you and not enough resources. The old ways of organising society, the ways that worked when populations were smaller and more dispersed, those don't work anymore. You can't just handle disputes through informal negotiation when you don't personally know most of the people in your community. You can't rely on everyone contributing voluntarily to communal projects when there are thousands of people and coordinating their efforts requires planning that exceeds any individual's capacity. You can't depend on the generosity of kin networks when most people around you aren't kin. You need something new technologies, new forms of organisation, new ways of thinking about resources and authority and social relationships. And remarkably, across all these different regions, people figure it out. Not all at once, not with a grand plan, but through experimentation and adaptation, and sometimes brutal trial and error. The societies that develop successful innovations survive and grow. The ones that don't, they collapse or get absorbed by more successful neighbours. And within a few centuries, you have the basic template of Bronze Age civilization, the institutional and technological toolkit that will characterise complex societies for the next 2,000 years. Let's start with the most fundamental problem: water. Because in the regions where populations concentrated in the river valleys that became the centres of civilization, water management wasn't optional, it was existential. In Egypt, you needed to capture and control the Nile flood, direct it to where you wanted it, make sure it irrigated your fields without washing them away or depositing sand instead of silt. In Mesopotamia, you needed to divert water from the rivers, carry it through canals to fields that might be kilometres away, maintain those canals against silting and salinisation, coordinate distribution so that fields downstream got their share. The technology for this existed before the drought. People had been irrigating in Mesopotamia for thousands of years, had been managing water in Egypt since farming began. But the scale was different now. A village of 200 people can dig and maintain a simple irrigation channel with informal coordination. Everyone knows when it's their turn to work. Everyone understands the system. Disputes get resolved through personal relationships. But a city of 20,000 people, that requires organisation, planning, authority structures, someone deciding how labour gets allocated, how water gets distributed, how disputes get resolved. This is when irrigation technology becomes truly sophisticated. In Mesopotamia, the canal systems expand dramatically. Not just small channels from rivers to nearby fields, but extensive networks carrying water tens of kilometres, interconnected systems where water flowing through one canal can be diverted into multiple smaller channels feeding different field complexes, and these systems require constant maintenance. Canals silt up, fill with sediment carried by the water. They need to be dredged regularly, cleaned out, kept at the proper depth and gradient. Without maintenance, they fail, and when irrigation fails in a region that depends on it entirely, people starve, so you get specialisation. People whose job it is to maintain the canals, not farmers who do it when they have time, but labourers who work on the irrigation system full-time, organised into crews, supervised by managers, paid in rations provided by the temple or palace institutions. These aren't voluntary work parties. This is administered labour. Someone at the top decides what work needs to be done, assigns crews, tracks who shows up and who doesn't, distributes payments. It's the beginning of bureaucratic management, of institutional control over labour. And the technology itself improves. The shaduf appears in Egypt during this period, a simple but ingenious device for lifting water, a long pole balanced on a vertical post, with a counterweight on one end and a bucket on the other. You lower the bucket into the water, the counterweight helps you lift it back up. You pour it into an irrigation channel or field. One person with a shaduf can move vastly more water than someone carrying buckets. It's a labour-saving technology, a force multiplier, and once it's invented it spreads rapidly, because everyone can see how useful it is. In Mesopotamia they're developing more sophisticated measuring systems, standard units for length, for volume, for weight. This matters because when you're allocating water or grain or labour, you need consistent measurements. If your measure of a field's size or a worker's ration varies depending on who's doing the measuring, The system breaks down, people feel cheated, disputes erupt. But with standardized measures, enforced by institutional authority, you can have confidence that everyone's being treated according to the same rules. It's the foundation of bureaucratic fairness, or at least the appearance of fairness. Storage technology advances too. Granaries become larger, more sophisticated. Not just pits dug into the ground or pottery jars, but substantial buildings designed specifically for storing grain. The archaeological evidence shows massive storage complexes attached to temples in Mesopotamia, in Egypt. Some of them could hold hundreds of thousands of litres of grain. That's food for thousands of people for months, maybe years. And that stored grain is power. Whoever controls the granaries controls survival. In a good year, they distribute generously, build loyalty. In a bad year, they determine who eats and who doesn't. The institutions that manage storage become the centres of economic and political power. And because stored grain is so valuable, it needs to be tracked. Who contributed how much to the stores? How much has been distributed? How much remains? Who's entitled to what ration? Before writing, this was managed through systems of clay tokens, different shapes representing different quantities or types of goods. These tokens would be sealed in clay envelopes, with marks on the outside indicating contents. If there was a dispute, you could break open the envelope and count the tokens. It worked, but it was cumbersome, limited in what it could express. Writing emerges as an administrative necessity. The earliest texts from Mesopotamia, from around 3200 BCE, are economic records. Tablets listing deliveries of grain, allocations of rations, inventories of livestock, assignments of workers to tasks. The script, cuneiform, starts as pictographic, images that represent objects. A symbol that looks vaguely like a jar means grain. A symbol that looks like a head means a worker or a person. Numbers are indicated by repeated marks. Over time, the symbols become more abstract, combinations of wedge-shaped marks that represent sounds, syllables, allowing the writing system to express anything that can be said in the Sumerian language. Egypt develops hieroglyphics around the same time, maybe slightly later. Same basic driver, administrative necessity. The earliest hieroglyphic texts are labels, names, titles, brief notations on pottery or ivory tags. The system is different from cuneiform, more pictorial, with symbols that represent both sounds and meanings, but the function is similar. Recording information permanently, creating accountability, enabling complex administration, and once you have writing, once you have this technology, it expands beyond its original administrative purpose. Within a few centuries, people are writing literature, recording myths and epics, writing laws, creating codes that everyone is supposed to follow, writing letters, communicating across distances, writing scientific and technical knowledge, preserving observations about astronomy, mathematics, medicine. Writing becomes the foundation of cultural transmission, allowing knowledge to accumulate across generations in ways that oral tradition couldn't match. But literacy remains rare. Learning to read and write cuneiform or hieroglyphics takes years of training. You need to memorize hundreds of symbols, understand complex grammatical rules, practice until you can write quickly and accurately. Most people never learn. The scribes who do become an elite class, essential to institutional functioning, well compensated, socially prestigious. In Mesopotamia, they established schools, temple and palace-sponsored institutions where boys from elite families or promising students from other backgrounds can be trained. The curriculum is rigorous, involving copying exercises, memorization, mathematical problems, legal formulas. By the end of your training, you're not just literate, you're educated in the cultural knowledge of your society. Metallurgy advances during this period too, though for different reasons. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that gives the Bronze Age its name, becomes more common. Bronze is harder than pure copper, holds an edge better, is more suitable for tools and weapons, but making bronze requires access to both copper and tin, and these metals aren't found in the same places. Copper deposits are relatively common across the Middle East. Tin is rare, found in only a few locations, meaning it has to be imported from distant sources. This creates economic pressure for long-distance trade. Cities that want bronze need to establish trade relationships with regions that have tin. The tin might come from Afghanistan, from Anatolia, from other sources far away. And that means trade routes, caravans carrying tin hundreds or thousands of kilometers, merchants negotiating with multiple intermediaries, goods changing hands many times before reaching their destination. Long-distance trade during this period becomes more organized, more systematic, more essential to civilization, and trade creates other pressures. You need ways to verify contracts, to ensure that goods promised are goods delivered. You need standardized weights so everyone agrees on what constitutes a fair exchange. You need some form of currency, or at least commonly accepted valuable goods that can facilitate exchange. In Mesopotamia, silver becomes a standard of value. Not coins yet, those won't be invented for another 2,000 years, but weighed silver, measured in standard units, used to calculate prices and settle debts. In Egypt, grain serves a similar function, standardized rations used as units of account. These economic innovations might seem dry, technical, not the stuff of exciting history, but they're revolutionary. They're creating abstract systems, conceptual frameworks that allow people who don't know each other, who don't have personal relationships, to interact economically with confidence. You can trade with a stranger because you both accept the same standards of weight and measurement. You can enter into a contract with someone from a distant city because the terms can be written down and enforced. These systems make complex economies possible, enable specialization and trade on scales that would be impossible with just personal trust and barter. Social stratification intensifies during this period, and that's not an accident. It's built into the system. When you have institutions controlling resources, when you have some people managing irrigation and others digging canals, when you have literate scribes and illiterate laborers, inequality becomes structural. The administrators accumulate wealth and power. The laborers remain poor, dependent on rations, with little opportunity to change their status. And at the top, leaders emerge who claim authority not just over economic resources, but over the entire society. In Mesopotamia, these leaders are initially temple officials, high priests who manage the temple estates and by extension control much of the city's economy. But increasingly, you also see secular rulers, kings who claim authority based on military power, on their ability to defend the city and conquer neighbors. These kings build palaces, separate from the temples, establish their own administrative apparatus, command armies. The balance between religious and secular authority varies by city and changes over time, but the pattern is clear. Centralized leadership emerging, individuals or small groups claiming the right to make decisions for entire populations. In Egypt, this process culminates in the pharaohs, kings who claim divine status, who present themselves as gods or sons of gods. The ideology is powerful. If the king is divine, if he's the earthly manifestation of cosmic order, then obeying him isn't just politically expedient, it's religiously necessary. Rebellion isn't just treason, it's blasphemy. This kind of ideological framework makes centralized authority much more stable, much harder to challenge, and it emerges directly from the crisis, from the need to organize large populations, coordinate complex projects, justify inequality and coercion. Religious innovations more broadly are fascinating during this period. The gods become more organized, more hierarchical, mirroring human society. In Mesopotamia, you have pantheons with clear structures. An, the sky god, at the top. Enlil, god of air and storms, executing An's will. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, creating and advising. And below them, numerous other deities with specific functions, specific domains. The gods have relationships, marriages, conflicts, genealogies. They're not just forces of nature anymore. They're personalized, have motivations and emotions, can be appealed to through proper rituals and offerings. And the relationship between gods and humans becomes more transactional. You build temples for the gods, provide offerings, perform rituals correctly, and in exchange the gods provide rain, ensure good harvests, grant victory in war, maintain cosmic order. The temples aren't just worship centers, they're the interface between human and divine realms, managed by priests who claim specialized knowledge of how to communicate with gods, how to interpret divine will. The priest's power comes from this claimed expertise. They're essential mediators, and that gives them enormous influence. In Egypt, the religious framework is similar, but with regional variations. The gods have different names, different attributes, but the basic pattern is comparable. A complex pantheon, clear hierarchies, transactional relationships between humans and deities. And the pharaoh positioned as the ultimate mediator, the one who ensures Mayat, the proper order of the cosmos. When the pharaoh performs the correct rituals, when he maintains justice and stability, The Nile floods, the crops grow, chaos is kept at bay. If he fails, if Ma'at is disrupted, disaster follows. This ideological framework justifies pharaonic authority and makes the king's power seem essential for cosmic stability. All of these innovations, technological and social and religious, they emerge rapidly during this period. Within a few centuries, from around 3700 to 3200 BCE, you go from relatively simple chiefdoms to fully developed states, complex bureaucracies, standing armies, monumental architecture, writing systems, sophisticated irrigation, long-distance trade networks, legal codes. Everything we associate with civilization appears or significantly advances during this window, and it's not coincidence that this happens during and immediately after the drought crisis. The crisis created the necessity, the concentrated populations created the scale, the competition for scarce resources created the selection pressure. Innovations that increased efficiency, that enabled better organization, that allowed societies to extract and mobilize more resources, these innovations succeeded. Societies that adopted them thrived, those that didn't were conquered or collapsed. But there's a cost to all this development, a cost that's easy to overlook when you're marveling at pyramids and cuneiform tablets and sophisticated irrigation systems. Freedom decreases. In small hunter-gatherer bands, in early farming villages, people had autonomy. They made decisions about their own lives. They could leave if they were unhappy. Social pressure existed absolutely, but you weren't bound to place or authority in the way that becomes normal in state societies. Once you're part of a complex administered economy, once you depend on institutional rations, once you're subject to laws enforced by armies and police, your freedom to opt out disappears. You can't just leave because your labour is part of the system. You can't refuse work assignments because that's insubordination, potentially punishable by force. You're locked in. And most people aren't benefiting equally from these innovations. The irrigation systems, the granaries, the trade networks, these primarily benefit elites, the kings and priests and administrators who control resources, who extract surplus from the labour of thousands, who live in large houses and eat well while labourers survive on minimal rations. The archaeological evidence shows increasing inequality during this period. Elite burials with enormous amounts of grave goods, precious metals and jewels and fine textiles. Common burials with nothing, just a body in the ground. The gap between rich and poor, between powerful and powerless, becomes a chasm. Violence is normalized too. States need armies, need the capacity for organized violence to defend resources, conquer neighbors, suppress internal dissent. Military technology improves. Bronze weapons become common among elite warriors. Fortifications become more sophisticated. Armies become larger, better trained, more effective, and warfare becomes more destructive. Early conflicts between chiefdoms might have involved a few dozen warriors, raids and skirmishes that were violent but limited in scale. State warfare involves thousands of soldiers, siege technology, systematic conquest and occupation. The earliest historical records, the texts that describe actual events rather than just listing resources, many of them are about wars, victories, captured cities, enslaved populations. And yet, despite all these costs, despite the loss of freedom and the increase in inequality and violence, the system works in the sense that it survives. The state societies that emerge from the drought crisis endure for thousands of years. Egypt remains unified for 3 millennia, through multiple dynasties, weathering crises and invasions, maintaining its basic structure. The Mesopotamian city-states compete and fight but persist, eventually coalescing into empires. The model spreads, other regions adopting similar organizational systems. The Bronze Age template becomes the standard for complex societies across Eurasia and North Africa. Why? Why does this particular form of organization succeed so well? Probably because it's effective at mobilizing resources, at coordinating large populations, at competing with rivals. A well-organized state can field larger armies than a collection of villages. It can undertake bigger projects, build better defenses, develop better technologies. In a world where states exist, other forms of organization are at a disadvantage. They can't compete militarily or economically, so the state form spreads, not necessarily because it's better for individuals, but because it's better at competition between societies. It's evolutionarily successful in a harsh selection environment, and from the perspective of people living through this transition, It probably didn't seem like a conscious choice. You adapted to survive. You accepted the new systems because the alternative was starvation or conquest or death. Maybe some people resisted, tried to maintain old ways, refused to submit to centralized authority. The archaeological record might preserve traces of these resistances, sites that don't fit the pattern, communities that remain egalitarian longer. But generally, these alternative approaches didn't succeed. They were absorbed or eliminated. The future belonged to the states, to the bureaucratic, hierarchical, militarized societies that figured out how to organize complexity and extract surplus and project power. For better and worse, this is the world the drought created. This is what emerged from crisis. By 3000 BCE, roughly 1,000 years after the drought began, the crisis had fundamentally reshaped the world. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but across the vast region from North Africa to the Indus Valley, the map of human civilization looked completely different than it had before. And here's the remarkable thing. The changes weren't temporary. They weren't adaptations that would revert once conditions improved. They were permanent, establishing patterns that would persist for millennia, creating the world we'd recognize as ancient civilization. Let's start with the most dramatic transformation, the Sahara. For thousands of years during the African humid period, it had been a populated landscape, grasslands and lakes supporting pastoral communities, cultures creating art and raising cattle and living sustainably in an environment that no longer exists. When the drought came, when the rains failed, those communities left or died, and the landscape never recovered. The monsoon system that had brought summer rains deep into North Africa had permanently shifted. The orbital mechanics that intensified the monsoons 11,000 years ago had changed. The feedback loops that sustained the Green Sahara, vegetation releasing moisture that fed more rainfall, those loops had broken and flipped into reverse. By 3000 BCE, the Central Sahara was desert, not drying out, not transitioning, but fully transformed into the landscape we know today. The Great Lakes had evaporated, leaving salt flats and dry basins. The rivers had stopped flowing, their beds now wadis that only carried water after rare, freak rainstorms. The grasslands had died, replaced by sand dunes and rocky plateaus where almost nothing grew. The animals had left or gone extinct. The people were gone entirely, leaving behind only their rock art, silent testimony to a world that no longer existed, and this transformation was irreversible, at least on human timescales. The Sahara has been desert for 5,000 years now, through countless climate fluctuations, through periods when other regions got wetter or drier. The basic pattern established by the 5.9 kiloyear event has persisted. The world's largest hot desert, an enormous barrier splitting Africa, a void on the map. Every person who's lived since 3000 BCE has known a world where the Sahara is empty, where crossing it is an extreme challenge, where the interior holds nothing but sand and death. But for the people who lived through the transition, for the generations who watched it happen, the Sahara was their home, their ancestors' land, the place where their cultures had flourished for thousands of years, all gone, all lost, transformed beyond recognition within a few human lifetimes. Imagine being old in 3500 BCE, your memories reaching back to childhood in the late 39th century. You remember when the Sahara was green. You remember your grandparents' stories about even wetter times. And now you're watching the final communities abandon the last marginal territories, watching the desert claim everything. The emotional weight of that, the grief of an entire world disappearing, it's almost incomprehensible. And yet that's what happened. That's what the drought did. But while the Sahara was dying, the river valleys were transforming in the opposite direction, becoming more populated, more developed, more complex. By 3000 BCE, you have three major centers of civilization, three regions where populations had concentrated and developed sophisticated states, and all the technological and social innovations we've been discussing. Egypt, unified under the pharaohs, Mesopotamia, divided into competing Sumerian city-states, and beginning to emerge, though it would take a few more centuries to fully develop, the Indus Valley civilization in what's now Pakistan and northwest India. Egypt by this point is unmistakably the Egypt we know from hieroglyphs and tomb paintings. The early dynastic period is underway. The kings are building elaborate tombs, step pyramids beginning to appear at Saqqara. The bureaucracy is established. scribes managing the state's resources, collecting taxes, organizing labor for monumental projects. The writing system is developed enough to express complex ideas, not just record transactions. And the ideology is firmly in place, the pharaoh as divine king, as the living embodiment of Horus, as the guarantor of Mayat and cosmic order. The population is substantial, probably over 1 million people living along the Nile by this point, most of them farmers working the floodplain. But also significant populations in the cities, Memphis at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt serving as the administrative capital, Thebes and other centres housing temple complexes and elite residences. The society is stratified, hierarchical. At the top, the pharaoh and his family. Below them, an aristocracy of officials and priests, people who manage the state apparatus and claim descent from the elite families that emerged during the unification. Below them, craftspeople and scribes, skilled workers who serve the state and the temples, and at the bottom, the vast majority, farmers and labourers who produce the surplus that sustains everyone else. And already, Egypt is building monuments that will last forever. The pyramids haven't reached their peak yet. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is still 500 years in the future, but smaller pyramids, mastaba tombs, temple complexes, these are being constructed, requiring thousands of workers, sophisticated engineering, organisational capacity that would have been impossible for the pre-dynastic chiefdoms. The ability to mobilise this kind of labour, to plan and execute multi-generational building projects, this is evidence of how far state organisation has advanced. The drought crisis forced centralisation, and centralisation enabled these extraordinary achievements. Mesopotamia looks different, politically fragmented but culturally unified. The major cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each functions as an independent state. They have their own kings, though the title and concept of kingship is still evolving. They have their own armies, their own administrative systems, their own patron deities, and they fight with each other constantly. Water rights, territorial boundaries, trade routes, prestige, all of these are causes for conflict. The wars aren't usually total, aren't usually aimed at complete destruction of the enemy. They're more about establishing dominance, extracting tribute, maybe controlling disputed territories, but they're frequent, endemic to the system. Yet despite the political fragmentation, Sumerian civilization is remarkably coherent. The cities share a language, Sumerian, and a writing system, cuneiform. They share religious concepts, worshipping the same gods even if different cities emphasize different deities. They share legal traditions, similar concepts of property and contract and justice. They share artistic styles, architectural forms, technological knowledge. A scribe from Uruk could travel to Ur and function effectively because the administrative systems were similar. A craftsperson could move between cities and find work because the techniques and materials were standardized. This is a civilization, a shared cultural sphere, even if it's not politically unified. And Sumerian cities by 3000 BCE are producing extraordinary cultural achievements. The earliest literature we have, the forerunners of texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh, are probably being composed during this period, though the versions that survive are later copies. Mathematical knowledge is advancing, systems for calculation and measurement being refined. Astronomical observations are being recorded, priests tracking the movements of planets and stars, developing calendars that allow precise prediction of seasons. Legal codes are being written, standardized rules for commercial transactions, property disputes, criminal offences. The foundation is being laid for everything that would come after, for the Akkadian Empire that would unite Mesopotamia, for the Babylonian civilization that would produce Hammurabi's famous law code, for the mathematical and astronomical achievements that would influence Greek science. And like Egypt, Mesopotamia is building monuments. The ziggurats, those massive stepped platforms topped with temples, the most iconic Mesopotamian architectural form, these are being constructed or expanded during this period. The White Temple at Uruk sitting atop its high platform, visible from kilometers away. The sacred precinct at Nippur, religious center of Sumer, where city-states would send offerings even when they were at war with each other. These structures represent enormous investments of labor and resources, but they're more than just religious buildings. They're statements of power, demonstrations that the cities that build them can mobilize thousands of workers, can extract sufficient surplus to support non-productive labor, can coordinate complex projects requiring planning and engineering, and sustained effort over years or generations. The Indus Valley is at an earlier stage of development in 3000 BCE, but heading in similar directions. The scattered farming villages along the Indus River and its tributaries are growing, consolidating. Within a few centuries, you'll have major cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, planned urban centres with sophisticated drainage systems, standardised brick sizes, evidence of centralised authority. The Indus Valley civilization will eventually develop its own writing system, though we still haven't deciphered it, can't read what they wrote. But the material culture, the archaeological evidence, shows a society that achieved the same basic organisational complexity as Egypt and Mesopotamia, that solved the same problems of managing large populations and coordinating labour and extracting surplus. So by 3000 BCE, you have a clear pattern. 3 major river valley civilizations, geographically separated but developmentally similar, all of them concentrated along rivers that provide reliable water for irrigation, all of them unified or consolidating politically, all of them developing writing, monumental architecture, complex administration, social stratification, military capacity, all of them following the same basic template, the Bronze Age model of civilization that emerged in response to the drought crisis. And these civilizations are connected not politically but through trade. None of them are self-sufficient. Each needs resources that don't exist locally. Egypt needs timber, which has to be imported from Lebanon. Mesopotamia needs metals, copper from Oman or Anatolia, tin from even more distant sources. The Indus Valley needs similar imports, so trade networks develop, long-distance routes carrying goods hundreds or thousands of kilometers, merchants and caravans connecting the civilizations, creating economic interdependence. These trade networks carry more than just physical goods. They carry ideas, technologies, cultural practices. A technological innovation developed in Mesopotamia, maybe a new type of seal or a better method for smelting bronze. That knowledge can spread to Egypt or the Indus Valley through merchant contact. An artistic style, a religious concept, a mathematical technique. These can diffuse across vast distances. The civilizations influence each other, even though they're politically independent, even though they might never have direct diplomatic contact. The Bronze Age becomes a connected world, not globally, but across a vast region from the Mediterranean to India. And the world these civilizations create is fundamentally different from anything that existed before the drought. The social order is hierarchical, stratified, with clear distinctions between elite and commoners, between free and enslaved. Slavery emerges as an institution during this period, war captives and debtors being forced into permanent servitude, their labour exploited without compensation. The states have legal frameworks that recognise and enforce these distinctions, that protect property rights of the wealthy, that punish transgressions by the poor more harshly than crimes by the elite. Inequality isn't just economic, it's legally enshrined, ideologically justified, enforced by the state's monopoly on violence. But the system is also productive in ways that earlier societies weren't. The agricultural surplus, extracted through taxation and tribute, funds specialists who advance knowledge and technology, the scribes who develop writing systems, the mathematicians who create computational methods, the astronomers who map the heavens, the architects who design buildings, the artists who create works of extraordinary beauty. None of this would be possible without the surplus, without the extracted labour of thousands of farmers and workers. The achievements of Bronze Age civilization rest on exploitation, but they're real achievements nonetheless, genuine advances in human knowledge and capability. The cultural memory of the crisis, of the migrations and chaos and transformation, persists in the mythologies these civilizations develop. Flood myths are common across the region. In Mesopotamia, stories like the Epic of Atrahasis describe gods deciding to destroy humanity with a flood. One righteous man warned to build a boat and save his family and animals. The biblical flood narrative, written down much later, derives from these earlier Mesopotamian sources. In Egypt, myths about chaos and order, about the gods establishing Ma'at against Tisfet, disorder, these might preserve memories of the crisis period when the old world collapsed and the new order emerged. Migration legends appear in multiple traditions. Stories about ancestors coming from other lands, about wandering before settling. The Egyptian concept of the followers of Horus, the semi-mythical warriors who unified the country, might preserve memory of the warrior elites who actually achieved that unification during the crisis. In Mesopotamian tradition, stories about early kings establishing civilization, bringing order from chaos, teaching people how to live in cities, these might reflect the actual social transformations that happened when populations concentrated and states emerged. And there's a bittersweet quality to these myths, a sense that something was lost as well as gained. The Sumerian king list, a later text that purports to list all the kings who ruled Mesopotamia, begins with a golden age, a time before the flood when kings ruled for impossibly long periods, when everything was better. Then the flood comes, and after that kingship has to be lowered from heaven again, re-established, but the world is never quite as good as it was before. This might reflect actual cultural memory, passed down through generations, of the green world before the drought, the time of abundance that ancestors spoke of, that was lost forever. By 3000 BCE, nobody alive remembers the beginning of the crisis. It's been 1,000 years. Even oral tradition, even stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, can't reliably preserve accurate memory over that many generations. But the knowledge that the world used to be different, that the Sahara was once inhabited, that populations once lived in regions now empty, that persists in some form. The rock art is still there, though probably few people see it because those regions are now so hostile that travel is difficult. But occasionally someone must have encountered those ancient images, those depictions of cattle and giraffes, and people in landscapes now barren, and wondered what it meant, how it was possible. And the environmental transformation is permanent. The desertification of the Sahara, the depopulation of the Arabian interior, the concentration of populations along the rivers, this pattern is set. For the next 5,000 years, through countless subsequent climate fluctuations, through rises and falls of empires, through technological revolutions from iron to gunpowder to steam to computers, this basic geographic distribution persists. The river valleys remain centres of population and power. The deserts remain barriers, crossed but not inhabited, shaping trade routes and military campaigns and cultural boundaries. The drought didn't just create a crisis that people survived. It fundamentally reshaped the human world, changed where people lived, how societies were organised, what forms of authority emerged, and those changes outlasted the drought itself, even when rainfall in some regions eventually improved slightly, even when climate fluctuations in subsequent millennia created better or worse conditions in various areas. The basic pattern established by the 5.9 kilo-year event remained. The institutional innovations, the social hierarchies, the technological advances, the political structures, these didn't disappear when they were no longer strictly necessary for survival. They persisted because they were effective at competition between societies, because states could conquer non-states, because bureaucratic administration enabled resource extraction that funded armies and building projects, because the people born into these systems knew nothing else and accepted them as natural. So when we look at ancient history, when we study the pyramids and the ziggurats and the palace complexes, when we read cuneiform tablets and hieroglyphic inscriptions, when we marvel at the achievements of Bronze Age civilizations, we're looking at the legacy of crisis. These civilizations emerge from catastrophe, built by refugees and their descendants, organized through innovations developed under desperate pressure, maintained through systems that traded freedom and equality for survival and order. That's not to diminish the achievements. The people who built these civilizations were remarkable, ingenious, resilient, capable of extraordinary creativity and organization. But their accomplishments came from specific circumstances, emerged from specific pressures. Understanding those circumstances, understanding the crisis that forced these transformations, that's essential for understanding what ancient civilization actually was, how it actually worked, why it took the forms it did. And that brings us to the final question. What does this history, this story of drought and migration, and innovation and transformation, what does it teach us? What relevance does it have for us, 5,900 years later, living in our own time of climate change and social stress? That's worth thinking about as we bring this journey to a close. So here we are, 5,900 years later. The Sahara is still desert. The Nile still flows through Egypt, though now it's dammed and managed in ways the ancient Egyptians never imagined. The cities of Mesopotamia are buried under Iraqi soil, waiting for archaeologists to uncover them. The world those refugees built, those desperate displaced people who concentrated along the rivers and figured out how to survive, that world eventually gave way to others. Bronze Age to Iron Age to classical civilizations to medieval kingdoms to the modern world we inhabit now. But the pattern they established, the template they created, that persisted. Centralized states, bureaucratic administration, writing systems, irrigation agriculture, social hierarchies, monumental architecture, all the pieces of what we call civilization, invented or refined during those crisis centuries, became the standard model for complex societies. We're still living with institutions that have their roots in that period, still organizing ourselves in ways that would be recognizable to a Sumerian scribe or an Egyptian administrator. And we're living through our own climate crisis now, not the same as theirs, not caused by orbital mechanics and monsoon shifts, but caused by us, by the civilization that ultimately traces back to those drought refugees. Our crisis is different in its mechanisms, but similar in its implications: displacement, migration, competition for resources, pressure to innovate or collapse. The patterns echo across millennia. But here's what that ancient story teaches us. Humans are adaptable. Remarkably, almost impossibly adaptable. Our ancestors faced catastrophe on a scale we can barely imagine. For 300 years, the rains failed. Millions were displaced. Ways of life that had existed for thousands of years disappeared. And somehow, people survived. Not all of them. Not without enormous suffering and loss. But enough survived. And more than survived, they built something new, something that endured, something that became the foundation for everything that came after. We carry that resilience in us. We're their descendants, literally, genetically. The adaptability that let them survive the worst drought in 10,000 years, that's in our DNA. Whatever challenges we face, whatever crises our generation has to navigate, we come from people who faced worse, who found ways forward when forward seemed impossible. So if you found this story helpful, if it gave you perspective or just helped you fall asleep, maybe hit that like button, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world. I love knowing this story is reaching people everywhere, connecting us across distance to a shared human past. Understanding where we came from, what our ancestors endured, the challenges they overcame. It's more than history, it's perspective. It's knowing that humans have always faced impossible odds and found ways to adapt, to innovate, to survive, to build. The drought ended eventually, the crisis passed, life continued, and 5,900 years later, here you are, safe and comfortable, drifting off to sleep, connected through time to those ancient people who watched their world transform and somehow made it through. Sweet dreams. And thank you for travelling back with me tonight to when the rain stopped falling and everything changed.